Change management is one of the most fundamental aspects of any digital transformation. However, it's oftentimes misunderstood and not fully comprehended in terms of how to execute an effective change management strategy. So in today's training session, I'm going to go deep into change management, what it means, and how you can deploy it to make your digital transformation or ERP implementation more successful. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO at Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And one of the core service offerings we provide to our clients is organizational change management. It's an area that I've spent my entire career. I started off as a change management consultant very early on in my career at one of the big four consulting firms. And one thing I've learned about change management over the years is that most organizations don't fully recognize the value of change management or they don't fully understand how to deploy change management effectively within their organizations. Too often, executive teams think that change is going to be easier than it really is. Too often, they get myopically focused on the technology aspects of transformation and they don't focus enough on the people side of the equation. However, beyond that, a lot of times teams don't know what else there is beyond just focus more on the people side of things. And so what I want to do today is provide a detailed framework and a detailed deep dive into what change management is and how you can deploy it in your digital transformation or any other sort of business transformation or corporate transformation project. So we've broken this training into 12 major sections, and just to give you a preview of what we'll cover here today, we're going to start off in section 1 with an overview of what is change management. Then we'll get into the basics of change management, slowly unpacking what the different components are. We'll get into terms and deliverables that you should be aware of. We're also going to talk about some of the top strategies that we've seen be most effective with our client work that we've done. We'll also talk about how to build a change management plan, how to overcome resistance to change in section 6. And then when we get to section 7, we'll talk about mistakes and pitfalls as it relates to change management. And then later in the video, we're going to get deeper into executive alignment and stakeholder management. So be sure to stick around for that, because that's arguably the most important part of this, is how do you get your stakeholders and your executive team fully on board and aligned with what the overall transformation is going to be. And then we'll get into training and adoption in section 9. Section 10, we'll get into Prosci and ADKAR, and we'll give an overview of how this all ties into Prosci and ADKAR concepts. And then we'll talk about change management and ERP implementations, as well as the future of change management. So with that all being said, let's jump into the first section, which focuses to start on the basics of change management. What exactly is change management? So let's start there. The thing with change management is that there's no one definition. There's no one standard way that change management is defined. And so I like to keep it really simple and define it on the surface as anything that is required to change people and to change your organization, to change your culture, anything to do with the people and human side of your business, anything to change that is what organizational change management is. So I'll talk in a few minutes in this video about what some of those tools and mechanisms are to change people. But the other part of change management is how to keep those people aligned. How do we keep our organization aligned, and not just understanding what the change is, but being aligned on what the change is and why it's happening and what it means to all of us. So in a nutshell, if I were to summarize a starting point of what change management is, it's anything to do with changing people, getting them aligned, and ensuring that the organizational and human aspect of your transformation is being addressed. Now, in addition to making sure that your people, your employees, your overall organization is aligned, and actually as a prerequisite to that, you want to make sure that your executives are aligned. A lot of times companies move forward with changes or transformations of some sort without having clear executive alignment and definition of what this change means to the organization, why we're doing it, what some of the key decisions are behind it. So our executives and also the key stakeholders within the organization need to be aligned on what this change is and how it's going to affect our overall organization. As an example, a lot of times we'll be hired by clients that will say, we want to standardize our business processes across the entire world. We're a global company, we want standard processes, we want everyone to act like one company. But what they don't realize is what the detailed decisions are behind that. What are the decisions that need to be made on what that exactly means to act like one company? Are there any exceptions to that? Is it a all or nothing type proposition, or are we somewhere on a spectrum? Those are the types of things that a lot of times executives and stakeholders aren't aligned on. And when they start the transformation and then hand it off or expect the rest of the organization to follow, there's a lack of clarity and there's confusion around what that really means. So it's really important to define a framework and sort of a skeleton of what the change is, make sure that the executives and stakeholders are aligned on that skeleton so that we can continue to flush out the details with the rest of the organization going forward. Now, typically, prior to change affecting employees, there is an identified change to a business processes or a set of business processes. So one of the first things we need to do in order to be effective at change management is to define what our changes to business processes are. And a lot of change management practitioners think that business process stuff is outside the realm of change management. They think that it's all about just dealing with the human side of things. But we also have to deal with the operational side of things because the human and operational side comes together along with technology to enable changes. And we have to understand what the changes to business processes are. We have to define that in detail. We have to define how technology is going to fit in, how roles and responsibilities are going to change, all that stuff that comes later. We can't do any of that until we've defined how processes are going to look going forward. So part of change management is, by necessity, defining what those future state business processes are. So once we've defined what the business process changes are, we inevitably lead to the conversation of how are people's jobs changing. If I typically had responsibility for a certain amount of work and you're going to take some of that work away, or you're going to add to my workload, or you're going to give me a new technology to do my job, or you're going to take away a spreadsheet that I've always used and obsessed over for 20 years, my job is changing and I need to understand what those changes are. And we as a change management team need to understand what those changes are so that we can communicate to people and help them transition through that change. Now, the thing about designing roles and responsibilities is that different people are affected and impacted differently. We work our way down from company-wide changes down to business units or locations, down to departments, down to individual work groups, and ultimately individuals. And we define what the changes to roles and responsibilities are for all of those different people. And a lot of times people think of change management as more of a shotgun approach where we just take a high-level view of what the changes are. We send out some emails, we tell the management team, and we call it good. But we have to get down to the real micro level of understanding how one individual person and each individual person's job may be changing. So that whole definition of roles and responsibilities is a critical component. Now, an often overlooked and hard to understand aspect of change management is culture. What kind of culture is it that you're trying to achieve with your organization? Are you trying to change your culture? Are you trying to become more of a flexible organization? Are you trying to become more of a customer-centric organization, a more efficient organization? Whatever the general type of change you're going through is going to have an impact or should have an impact on your culture. And in order for us to change the culture, we have to change the people. And in order to change the people, we have to change the culture. So it's sort of a closed loop cycle. And so change management has to take culture into account. And we have to figure out what are the things we can do to start to bend the culture and start to influence the culture, recognizing that it's not going to happen overnight. And if we're trying to achieve a certain future state, it's going to take years or maybe even longer to get there, but we can start influencing that culture and directing people in that direction now. Now, the younger of a company you are, the easier a cultural change typically is. If you're a more established organization with highly tenured employees, it's going to be a bit harder to change that culture. But regardless, you still want to define what that culture is, and cultural change is a core component of change management. So when it comes to execution, the next component of change management is helping employees through the journey, helping them through the transition, helping them understand that this is our future state over here, here's where we are today, and how are we going to help them migrate from point A to point B. And so it's really that execution part of defining how is it we're going to help each individual person and each individual work group transition through the change throughout the organization. And again, this is going to be something that's tailored to you. Every change management plan and strategy and approach should be tailored for your organization. And watch out for cookie cutter approaches, because cookie cutter methodologies and tool sets typically don't work because they're cookie cutter and they aren't unique to who you are and who you're trying to become. So defining what that transition plan is and what the overall change transition plan is going to be is a very core and important part of what organizational change management is. And now the final major component of organizational change management that a lot of change, if not most change practitioners fail to recognize, is benefits realization. How do we measure the results? How do we identify how our efforts should and will impact our actual company-wide performance. So if we're trying to become a more customer-driven, a customer-centric organization, for example, how is it that we're going to measure and hold individuals accountable? And how can we actually measure the results after the fact to see how successful we were in our change efforts so that we can modify and pivot and reinforce where needed? So benefits realization and that more pragmatic and tangible and quantitative side of change is extremely important, and it's a bit different than the soft, touchy-feely side of change management. It's very hands-on and tactical, but it's very important and something that oftentimes gets overlooked. But benefits realization is the final major component of what organizational change management is or should be. Now that we've talked a little bit about what change management is at a high level, we want to go one level deeper now and talk more about the basics of change management. What are some of the core pieces of change management that you should be aware of? In this video for this section, this is actually an interview I did with one of our change management team members to really unpack some of the fundamentals of change management to set the tone and the context for the rest of the sections here in this video.
I'm originally from Michigan, and my career started out as organic growth, right? So being from Michigan, you have a limited amount of industries you can choose from, and primarily it was at the time healthcare and or manufacturing. So I started off in manufacturing, where I got my taste of process improvement, Lean Six Sigma Black Belt work, Red X strategies work. And through my journey, I understood that you can't just look at a process or a technology and expect it to work with people involved. So I have my Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. I also have a Prosci certification in change management. I'm an executive leadership coach. And in terms of industry experience, as I stated, healthcare, manufacturing, IT, logistics, distribution, and wealth management. So kind of had the whole spectrum, and I've been growing along the way.
Very good. Constantly learning and applying those pretty broad skill sets to a number of different situations. I want to come back to that too, by the way, because I'm always fascinated by anyone who's not just a change management practitioner, but also has other disciplines that they focus on. I think that's a fascinating combination. So I want to come back and ask you a question about that here in a second. But before we dive into that, though, maybe just for the average person that might be listening that doesn't really know what change management is, they've heard the term, maybe they know it's important, but what in the world does change management mean? How would you sort of simplify it, dumb it down, however you want to describe it, just for the person that doesn't know much about change management?
Well, what I will say is what it is not. It is not fuzzy bunnies and rainbows and kittens. Okay, that is not it. To me, it's a systematic approach that deals with technology, processes, as well as people. So we have tools and techniques that really address the process and technology, but also the people side of change. It's very important to understand that whatever initiative you're doing, people will be involved, and you need to understand how these impacts affect them, what are their stressors, be able to identify resistance points so you can create plans and actionable items to address those, and really help people along the way to not only embrace it and accept it, but own it. In a nutshell.
I love how you stated what it's not, because I think that's, even though that's not what I asked, I think it's perfect description, because that I agree that a lot of, especially at the executive level, you find that people think that, oh, it's just a kumbaya session or a way to make people feel good. Maybe it has that unintended benefit, but the real benefit is to really transform the business, deliver value, more tangible results.
Yeah, and also when people who hear change management, traditionally, they think change management, steering committees, things like that, where you get a group of people together that make decisions on a process or technology change. It's not really addressing the people side of change. I had an interesting conversation today with a potential sponsor, and through our conversation and dialogue, I was painfully aware what he thought change management was, in his traditional role versus what we were trying to accomplish. So again, having the skill set of identifying those nonverbal cues, change and inflection, even the way they're answering questions kind of led me down the path to get an understanding of where he was really at in terms of understanding his role as sponsor.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Well, so we've talked a little bit about at a high level what change management is, what it's not. Why is it so important? It sounds like a no-brainer question, but I think it's a really important question.
Yep. So this is another favorite question of mine. So whenever I'm talking to a client or a team, I ask them, to tell me about your process. Is your process 99.9% automated? And 9 times out of 10, they tell me no. Well, if there is a people factor in your process or technology change, you cannot ignore that. So it's very, very important to get the understanding that we are impacting the way people do their jobs, their daily lives between 9 to 5 or whatever. So you have to be able to understand where they're at in their understanding, how to communicate the changes, how to identify potential resistors, and be able to mitigate that and create a change team that can address those when you're not around as a change management professional.
Yeah, perfect. And one thing that I found in that sort of validates what you're saying, the importance of change management, is that in anytime we're hired to go do a project recovery and sort of clean up a failed project, or when we're hired as an expert witness to provide an opinion on why a project failed, it almost always comes back to change management. There's some heavy change management failure that led to the problem. It's usually not because the technology didn't work or even that the processes didn't work. It's because the people side of the equation wasn't addressed well.
And honestly, I am a firm believer that people don't come to work to want to do a bad job. They come to work to be productive, to be part of something, to be part of a solution. And if you miss that opportunity to bring your team into the fold, to have those conversations, it can impact the success of what you're doing. So, when you have people who actually touch the process and they're the closest, they have the most valuable information. It's really easy to, configure something or draw something, but until you're understanding how that is impacting the people who are actually using it, you're going to miss a big opportunity. So you should probably get into the change management mindset early on to create that wealth of knowledge you can use to mitigate any resistors or issues you have moving forward. It's better to do it up front than to do midpoint or after, because then you've created another issue, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it just taking that one step further, I think it's important to think of change management as something that's on your critical path.
Yes.
The ultimate time and cost of your transformation is going to be largely determined by how well you address change management. And while it may seem like a net investment or a net cost, it really isn't. I mean, it's actually going to save you time and money by handling change management well.
Absolutely.
So that's an important point. I guess a follow-up question to why change is so important. Why is it so hard? Why do so many organizations struggle with change in general, especially as it relates to the human component?
I honestly think that, and again, I believe people don't come to work wanting to do a bad job. I just think that the education, the awareness of what it really isn't there. So even the conversation I had today with a client, he came from Michigan. He understood, manufacturing and the importance of getting in early, making sure these changes are identified and we have plans to do them. But a senior level management wasn't as passionate as he is at this point to address those issues. So getting the awareness of what change management is and how to implement, when to implement, and the best mitigators around the problem that we can come up with is why I feel people don't engage soon enough. It's when you have the initiative rolling of process and technology and things aren't really moving to where they need to go, and they ask why is this happening? And then at that point, yes, we come in and we help, but it would have saved, to your point, time, money, resources had we gotten in earlier.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that does, that approach that you're advocating of getting in earlier and addressing change management earlier, is you get to see how big the bread box is, how much of a change or an impact is this really going to have. I think a lot of times companies think, well, let's just wait until we get closer to go live and we think about training and doing some of that downstream stuff, but by then you've already walked into a mess of organizational challenges and pitfalls and risks.
Especially if you're merging cultures. So, you think that, okay, we have the best culture, but guess what? Those two other merger companies think they have the best culture. They have the best processes. So right from the onset, even in planning phase, you have a mindset that goes against what you're trying to create, which is one cohesive organization. So if you're only looking at the nuts and bolts and the process steps and trying to figure out, which you need to follow as an organization, you miss all of those nonverbal cues, those unspoken attitudes and perceptions that once you do create a process or technology that you're going to have to address. You have to address it, unless, again, your process is 99.99% automated, people are involved, and you need to address the people factor. So you just can't get around it. Or you're going to pay now or pay later, right? So pick your poison, right?
Yeah. Well, let me play devil's advocate. I'm going to talk about a process that I might automate 99.99%. And you can tell me if there's a change impact here or not. But let's just say I'm using, artificial intelligence or robotic process automation, one of these really cool technologies that are, offered as a standalone, or they're integrated within, enterprise technologies of different sorts. Game-changing stuff that could totally streamline a process or an operations. Does that mean that change management won't be important in that case, or how would change, if so, if it is going to be important, how would change management fit into that, something like that?
So I guess let me ask you a question. So you have a process that's evolved to become more efficient, more automated, et cetera, right? So you've grown to a level. Now you need less people, but you're going to need people. So when you're trying to get to that next level of generation or growth, it's not going to happen automatically. You're still going to have people involved. You're still going to need to understand, what were the barriers? What were the problems? What are the best opportunities, the best practice, et cetera? What are the results? How do you interpret the results? Do these results make sense to the people involved? So there's still a component of people if you want to continue growing in your practice. Now, if you don't, and you just want to level and, stay there stagnant forever, I would say, maybe you're going to have to figure out, is the button to push by the human in the right place every time? I don't know.
Right.
But
Right.
I mean, so I liken change management to dinosaurs, right? If you don't change, you're going to end up dying out. If you don't evolve, you got to keep moving. In business today, it's so quick, and the speed is mind-blowing sometimes. And if you're not capturing that, the change in the people, process, technology, you're going to miss out. So our markets are driven by competition. You have to have a competitive edge. And honestly, from what I've seen, the competitive edge is our people. We have to give them the respect and the due diligence to understand, how can we not only make our process and technology better, but how can we make our people better? How can we involve them? How can we grow ownership, accountability? Because they're the ones at the end of the day that produce the results.
Right. Yeah. And it's, I can't remember how long I've been hearing the same comment from executives and project teams of, well, we've got this change or this new technology, a process improvement that's going to allow people to do less manual work and focus more on the strategic aspects of their job. Mm-hmm. And it sounds good in theory, and maybe you plug in a number in your business case that somehow quantifies that. But what does that mean? If I'm I'm an employee and you're bringing in artificial intelligence or any sort of technology to automate what I'm doing, and you're taking away some of my manual work that's low value, what does that mean for my job? Am I going to,
Exactly.
what am I going to fill my time with if I'm not spending half my time doing manual stuff or whatever the case may be? So I think
And
that's
again,
a really good point.
I think through the evolution of growth, we're taking, to your example, people who are engaged in manual work, and now you want to elevate them to more strategic, et cetera, et cetera. That's still going to assist your AI. It's still going to help your growth. But if you're not addressing the changes, even in their roles and responsibilities, you have changes in reporting structure, changes in tools that you're using. They're going from manual to this. And what does that mean? And how do I connect to my new position? In my experience, most resistance comes from a place of not understanding what the change is, why are we doing it, and how is it impacting me? Once we address that, the ownership and accountability grows. And I've seen teams that have exploded. And I'm like, that mama bird looking at her little birdies flying out and being all successful. It's the best feeling. I'm telling you, it's amazing. And it just took someone to identify those opportunities, put a plan together, and work through it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what are some of the biggest pitfalls or change pitfalls you see from a change management perspective, typically when you're working with our different clients?
So the first would be the time of inclusion of change management. So when do we get to be part of the conversation? Traditionally, it's been midpoint or end, like a handoff type thing, which again, we discussed earlier, that's a huge opportunity missed, right? And if we are lucky enough to get in at the ground level, right, to help build a foundation, because what happens when you build a foundation on sand, it kind of shifts, but change management can help build a solid foundation. The understanding of what change management is, an understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are from a change management perspective, in my opinion, is the next biggest opportunity, as well as understanding how to communicate the changes at what levels, when are you going to do it, and creating that community of change agents. Like one person cannot move a mountain. You need to create an army of people who believe in what you're doing, embrace the change, and help it move forward. You really need to. And then creating trust in your teams is so important. Walk the walk. Walk the walk. If I tell you, hey, Eric, I'm going to come to you every Friday and we're going to have a download. First couple Fridays, we have our download, and the third one, it's skipped. I just broke your trust. And now anything else that I tell you, you're not going to accept. So you have to be able to have those things in place in order to continue growing your change management initiative.
Right.
And let me know if I talk a little fast, because I kind of get on my soapbox and run with it. So
no, that's important. And those are some really good pitfalls. And actually, you triggered another question about when you were talking about not getting change management started at the right time. When you think about when a change program should start and when it should finish, what does that timing look like? When and where does it fit within an overall transformation? How do we understand that?
Sure. So in my opinion, it's helpful to start at the inception of a project, because having that change management scope and mindset, you're going to be asking questions that someone else might not have asked, right? You're coming from a different perspective. And from my experience, you need to look at whatever it is you're doing from every angle to get every perspective you can, so you can get ahead of the issues, right? Change management should be in the beginning, middle, and does it really end is the question, right? So you've just created this army of change agents that are excited and, they're engaged and they own it and they're accountable. Do you really want, as an organization, to stop the momentum? Because change does not live in one project only. It's the way to grow your company. Because if I know that my ideas are going to be heard and maybe entertained, maybe something I come up with will be working and maybe it won't, I still know what I'm doing is I'm adding value to the company. I'm part of the company and its success and growth. If you cut that off at the end of a project, you're really doing a disservice to yourself. because
Right.
human equity or human capital is what builds great companies.
Right. Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, no matter what industry you're in or what kind of organization you have, that human capital piece of it is important, especially in cases where you're trying to create a culture that is gonna get people excited, and you
Yeah,
want high morale and
absolutely.
you want performance. And we get a lot of clients who will say, we've got these high standards for our human capital management function and how we treat employees, the culture we're creating. But then they go through this sort of transformation and they totally underperform from a change
Yep.
management perspective. They don't realize what a big impact this is going to be. So I think that's a good point.
And especially in this climate, you have a lot of talent looking for a place to grow and a place to flourish. And there's a lot of opportunity. So companies, in my opinion, should capitalize on that and create atmospheres of inclusion. And we want to hear your ideas because, like I said before, one man cannot move a mountain. It takes a team of people to work together to understand the challenges, put solutions in place, and make it happen. So,
Right. Yeah.
and that's not
Now,
always easy work.
yeah. None of this is easy work. Otherwise, I guess more people would do it and more people would be successful at it. Now that we understand what change management is, we understand the basics of change management, let's talk specifically about what some of the different terms and definitions are of change management within the realm of change management. One of the first things that's very important to understand as a change management practitioner is the concept of resistance to change. And on the surface, it sounds simple enough. It means it's when humans resist change. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that, because oftentimes, more often than not, you can't see or tell when people are going to resist change. And it's also more often than not that people are not blatantly trying to sabotage a project. They're typically not trying to derail a project, but because we're all human, we all have human weaknesses. There's human weaknesses that come into play that cause us to resist change in some way, in some fundamental aspect of our transformation. So that's what resistance to change is. And there's two types of resistance. There's intentional resistance, which is I feel threatened, therefore I want to intentionally derail the project. That's not the most common form of resistance to change. But the more common form of resistance is unintentional resistance. So this is really striking at the heart of who we are as people. It's underlying root causes that are triggered by fear, anxiety, uncertainty, lack of information, internal politics. All those sorts of things can manifest themselves in resistance to change. So regardless of what the source of resistance is, it's important to understand that people will resist change, and managing that resistance to change is a key component of effective organizational change management. One of the early initiatives that should happen in any sort of change initiative is to focus on stakeholder analysis. And a stakeholder analysis is really looking at your key executives and key influencers within an organization to understand what makes them tick. What is their role in the organization? Who do they influence? What is their view of the project? Are they aligned as a team? All that understanding of these different stakeholders is very important, because ultimately you want to make sure that you get alignment, which I'm going to come back to that point here later in this video. But you want to make sure people are aligned, that you have that internal alignment at the executive and stakeholder level. And you also want to make sure that you understand what makes them tick, so that you can target those stakeholders to make sure that they're informed, to make sure they're part of the process, and ultimately to make sure that they buy into and support the overall transformation. So that sort of stakeholder analysis is a critical term and definition to understand in any sort of change initiative. Just a moment ago, I talked about alignment and how you want to make sure your stakeholders are aligned. And that's part of a stakeholder analysis, but I actually call out executive alignment as its own standalone term and definition, because that is very important. And the key to executive alignment, which is a bit different than stakeholder analysis, is to ensure that you have an executive team that's aligned and has a common shared set of goals and objectives for the transformation initiative. Sounds simple enough, but a lot of executive teams for a lot of organizations throughout the world are not aligned on what they want to be when they grow up. And if they don't know what they want to be when they grow up, or if they have misaligned expectations on what they want to be when they grow up, it's almost impossible to lead effectively a change initiative. So our job as change practitioners is to ensure that we support and enable that executive alignment as much as possible. Now, we're not just talking about executive alignment here, we're also just talking about internal alignment in general. Certainly it starts at the executive level, But you also want to make sure that mid-level management all the way down to the frontline employees are aligned in terms of what this project means, how they're supporting the project, how this overall transformation will support the organization going forward. All that stuff, you need to make sure that you have that level of alignment so that you're not facing headwinds and you translate those potential headwinds into tailwinds to help further enable a successful change initiative. Any organization going through any sort of digital or business transformation is migrating from point A to point B. In other words, there's the current state, where they are today, and where they want to be in the future. Now, for some people, they think that it's as simple as just deploying new technologies. But the reality is, yes, technology is going to change, but the real change, the more fundamental change, is at the employee level. Individual humans are being impacted by that technology. Their jobs are changing. Certain parts of their job might go away. Certain parts of their job might get reassigned to others within the organization. But there's a whole organizational design concept that leads to change impacts. And so as change practitioners, we really need to understand what are the change impacts to the organization? How exactly will this transformation change each person's job, each department's job, each business unit or each location? How will those different areas be affected differently? And so it's a really focused, almost surgical way of analyzing how different parts of the organization are affected. And ultimately that should lead to a change management strategy and plan that addresses those specific change impacts. Now, next on our list is training and enablement, oftentimes referred to as employee or user enablement. And essentially what this is training employees on how to use the new technologies. Now, for a lot of people, they think that this is a technical exercise. We're just going to show people how the technology works. That certainly is part of training and enablement, but the more important part of training and enablement is showing people how they're going to use technology to do their day-to-day jobs, and also to show what their end-to-end job looks like, both in areas where they're using the new technology and maybe even in some areas where they're not touching technology. It might be a decision process, or they might be turning to other technologies that weren't involved in the transformation that are going to become key parts of their job. So the key here is not just to train people on new technologies, but more importantly, to train people on their business processes, what their new roles and responsibilities are going to be. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty extensive proposition. Now, one thing I'll note is that training and enablement should not wait until the very end to happen. You should be starting those activities earlier than your pre-go live training that happens right before go live. You want to be training people on their new processes, their new roles and responsibilities along the way so that they work through those and understand those high-level changes, so that by the time you get to the end user training right before go live, it's more focused on the technology and more the transactions of how they're going to do what they've already been told in terms of how their jobs are going to change. So this is a key part of change management that every organization should be well aware of. Next on our list is communications plan, and it sounds pretty self-explanatory, but there's a lot to a communications plan. Essentially what it is defining all the different stakeholders, all the different departments, maybe even some influential individuals within your organization, and defining who those target audiences are for different communications messages that need to happen throughout a transformation. And communications plans typically start from day one of a transformation and continue all the way through and even after the go live of new technologies or new business processes or whatever the transformation entails. And so the communication plan really outlines in detail who the audience is, how we're going to reach that audience, the frequency, when we're going to reach the audience, what vehicle or mechanism we're going to use to reach that audience. So are we going to send emails? Are we going to do in-person meetings, one-on-one meetings, group meetings, departmental meetings, whatever the case may be, or it could be digital delivery of messaging as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can deploy messaging to organizations, and the key here is that you want to identify who those people are, what the messages are, and you want to make sure you have a variety of ways of reaching different people. Now, one thing to note about communications planning is you want to think of it as much like a marketing plan or a marketing strategy. You have to repeat the same messages repeatedly over and over in order for people to fully understand the message. So while you, as part of a project team or part of a transformation, may fully understand and be well aware of what the impacts of the transformation are, most people in your organization don't understand it nearly as well as you do. So you really have to drive those points home and really err on the side of repetition and frequency to ensure that you're reaching your intended audience and to ensure that you're reaching them via different vehicles, whether it's email combined with in-person meetings, combined with flyers posted on the wall, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure you have a clear and deliberate plan for how you're going to communicate key messages to employees as they're affected by the transformation. Next up is organizational design. And this is one of the more overlooked concepts within organizational change management. And the reason for that is a lot of times people focus on some of the other stuff I've already talked about, the communications plan, the training and enablement. Those are two examples of areas that are just intuitive to most people. They understand because it's very tangible. It's something you can see and touch and feel. And so that becomes the focus and the priority for a lot of organizational change strategies. But something like organizational design is just as important, maybe even more important than all the other things I've talked about so far, which is why it's so high on our countdown list here. And essentially what organizational design is defining how people's jobs are going to look after the transformation. So for example, if you're automating 50% of Susie's job because now you're deploying an artificial intelligence-based application that's going to automate 50% of her job that's going to go away, now we need to define, well, what does her job look like? What is that other 50% going to be consumed with? A lot of times executives and project team members will gloss over that really important point, which will contribute to the resistance to change later on, which I talked about earlier. So in order for Susie not to resist change, she needs to have a clear vision of what her job is going to look like. And we as managers and leaders need to understand what that job is going to look like so that we can deploy those changes and change expectations, change job roles and responsibilities, change job descriptions, change compensation plans if needed. There's a whole host of activities that go into redesigning an organization, but you need to be deliberate about it and make sure you clearly articulate and define what that organizational design is going to look like in the post-transformation world that you're headed toward. Another underrated and often overlooked aspect of change management is benefits realization. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, and we take what are generally soft, touchy-feely, and intangible aspects of change management, and we translate it into measurable business value. So what is it that we're doing as an organization in terms of organizational changes, process improvements, change impacts, all the stuff we've talked about so far? How do those activities drive real business value? And we want to connect the dots so that we're focused on activities that are going to increase business value. So for example, if our business case for our transformation is that we want to reduce costs by increasing efficiency, then our change management activities should really focus on those tangible aspects of the change. Let's focus on those areas that are going to drive efficiency and increase productivity and increase overall profitability. And not only does this help with the transformation overall, because it focuses on those right metrics and translating some of the change activities into measurable measures, but it also builds a business case of justification for the change management efforts. A lot of organizations fail to recognize the need for change management, but when it's tied to those measurable areas of business value, it becomes easier to justify those change activities. So be sure you include benefits realization as part of any sort of organizational change strategy that you might be involved with. Number 2 on our list is organizational readiness. And organizational readiness is exactly what it implies. It's how ready is the organization for change. So we've defined new processes, we've defined what a new technological roadmap is going to look like, we've put together our communications plan, our change strategy, all the stuff we've talked about so far in this video. But at some point, there are milestones along the way where you have to measure how ready is the organization? What is the temperature of the organization? Where are the pockets of resistance? How are people managing the change? How are they coming along with the change? Are the people ready for the change? So in other words, if we're 30 days before go live and people are expressing extreme doubt or concern about their ability to do their jobs, that's a red flag that you want to make sure you mitigate before you go live. But organizational readiness isn't just something you do right before go live. It's actually something you should start from the very beginning and continue to measure, because it's something that will continue to evolve throughout the transformation. So organizational readiness assessments are a key quantitative and qualitative tool that we use to ensure that we are measuring the health and the temperature of an organization and the overall readiness of the organization for change, so that we can pivot the overall change strategies and the overall program strategies to address whatever risks or concerns are arising during those assessments. So be sure that you have this whole concept of organizational readiness as part of your overall change strategy. Number 1 on our list is a culmination of everything we've talked about in this video so far, and that is your organizational change plan. This is arguably the most important part of change management, which is why it's number 1 on our list. So the organizational change plan is really the way that we tie together all these other 9 areas we've talked about, as well as other areas that aren't in our top 10 list, and it puts them into a more definitive, predictable project plan. So each of these work streams we've talked about so far will have their own subtasks and resources and dependencies, deliverables, and ultimately this change plan needs to be integrated into the overall program plan. So it's something that you want to make sure is aligned, and you want to make sure you reconcile whatever timeline the overall program is on with the change management plan. Now, one caveat or one word of caution as it relates to creating a change plan is we oftentimes see that the change plan is inconsistent with the overall program plan. So in other words, the overall program plan might have a very aggressive time frame, and the change plan might suggest that the time frame needs to be longer. And oftentimes, it's the change management side of things that will cause delays in a project. So ultimately, you have to reconcile those two things and decide how aggressive do we really want to be with our timeline and how much do we really want to invest in change management. I would argue that it's typically cheaper and a higher business value to go ahead and invest in change management, but it's up to you as an organization to define that. But regardless of what answer you come to related to that question, you want to make sure you have a clear change management plan that supports the overall program management plan. Now that we understand the overview of change management, the basics of it, we understand some of the deliverables and terms that are important for change management, let's talk specifically around change management strategies. What are the change strategies that are most effective? And really what we want to do here is dive into how change management strategies don't just focus on training and communications, they focus on other aspects in the broader purview of change as well. So just to set the backdrop for what organizations and their people are going through right now, is they're going through a lot of change, and there's a certain amount of change fatigue that people are suffering from right now within organizations. As I mentioned, they're dealing with not only pandemic and health concerns, they're dealing with economic issues in many cases, they're dealing with a lot of uncertainty at the organizational level and at the personal level, and there's just been a lot of change imposed on people that they may or may not be happy with or comfortable with. So whether you like it or not, your people have already gone through a great, huge amount of change. And if you throw a business or digital transformation on top of that, now all of a sudden you're talking about potentially reaching a breaking point where people just simply aren't able to keep up with the magnitude of change in the world. So this is a concept that's commonly known as change fatigue. And when we've talked about change fatigue in the past, or when we've talked about change fatigue with clients in the past, typically it's been in the context of when we're trying to change our business or improve our business. If we do it too quickly or we impose too much change at once, that can create change fatigue. And that still is a risk with organizations going through transformations. But today we have to worry about the change fatigue that may already exist before we've even started our digital or business transformation. And for many of the reasons I mentioned, those changes have been imposed on people leading up until now. So when we create our change strategies, we really have to do a good job of getting a pulse on where people's heads are and their level of comfort with change in general, and their overall stress level and morale level. That's very important to really understand as a baseline where people's heads are and how open to change they may be or how resistant to change they may be because they've potentially simply had enough. So understanding this whole concept of change fatigue and really looking at change readiness and assessing the readiness of your organization to handle even more change is something that's very important and a sort of prerequisite to defining an effective change strategy in today's day and age. Just as people have been affected, not necessarily by choice, by a bunch of external factors, organizations themselves have also been affected by external factors. Many of you may work in organizations that were affected by the pandemic and the resulting economic impact. It could have been an increase in demand for your product or service that your organization provides. For some organizations, they were negatively impacted by the world events. But whatever the impact, we have to understand that there's been some external impact to our organizations and to our culture as an organization. So we really have to look at and understand what our culture is today, how our culture has been affected by external events, and what it is we really want our culture to be in the future. And in change management is a great opportunity for us to more deliberately focus on how we want to improve our culture and how we want to continue to improve that culture to better align with our overall goals and objectives as an organization. So one of the first steps to effective change management, especially in today's day and age, is to look at what our culture is today, what kind of culture we need to enable whatever goals and objectives and external factors we think we're going to be facing to ensure that we are getting ahead of the curve and bending the culture the way we want to. So doing a cultural assessment and having a cultural change strategy is a very important part of any sort of effective change strategy in today's day and age. Now, at the same time that people are changing or feeling change, at the same time cultures are being impacted or feeling change from external factors, You also have your own operations and technological change that we have to figure out how to tie it all together. So in other words, we need to figure out, as part of our change strategy, how do we align our people, our processes, and our technologies. And organizational change management is typically the glue that holds that all together. So when we look to the future of where we're headed as an organization, and now that we're starting to get used to the way the world is today and the way it's evolving, for better or for worse, we need to understand how we can use change management to ensure that we are furthering the organization, improving the organization from an operational perspective, technological perspective, and ultimately a people perspective as well. And change management, like I said, is really the glue that holds that all together. So think of your change strategy as a way to tie together those three pieces to really align with the future of where you're headed as an organization. Once we have a handle on people, processing, technology, and how we're going to bend our culture, how we're going to address change fatigue, now we need to define what our change strategy is, and we need to define an effective change management strategy that will best align with who we are as an organization and where we're headed as an organization. And what's important here is that change management typically is most effective when you take your overarching strategy, your goals and objectives at a corporate level, and you translate that into specific transformation and change strategies that are aligned with that bigger picture strategy. So in other words, instead of coming in and saying, we're going to define a change strategy and an overall transformation strategy, and doing that in a vacuum, not in the context of your overall strategy, goals, and objectives, that's going to create a certain amount of misalignment that can create a lot of problems later on in your transformation. So one of the first things we want to do is defining a clear change strategy that takes your strategy, goals, and objectives and translate that into meaningful change strategies and tactics, as well as overarching transformation strategies and tactics that ensure that we have that level of alignment with the overall direction of the organization. Now, just as we want our change strategy to be well aligned with our overall corporate strategy, we also want to make sure that our executives and internal stakeholders are all aligned as well. So once we've defined this change strategy and what it is we're going to do to better align our people, process, and technologies and affect our culture and bend our culture the way we want to, now we need to look at ways that we ensure that our executives are aligned and our stakeholders are aligned in what that change means to the organization. And this is really a way to continue to unpack and to continue to cascade those change strategies down throughout different parts of the organization. And we want to make sure we're all rowing in the same direction, that all the different parts of the organization are going the same direction. And so making sure we're all aligned and that we have the same vision and definition of what this project means or what this transformation means to us in our part of the organization is something that's very important. And the larger and more complex and more diverse your organization is, the more likely it is that you're going to be misaligned as a team. And then when you throw curveballs on top of that, such as macroeconomic or pandemic type of factors that are external to the organization, that creates even more misalignment. So alignment and looking at executive and stakeholder alignment is more important than ever, given all the changes that are happening in the world today. So we want to make sure we have a clear alignment strategy for how to get our stakeholders aligned. Just sort of rounding out this whole picture of what change management is and the things that you should be doing to address change management. This is a slide just looking through sort of the change management objectives and the things that you should accomplish or do as part of a change management effort to make it successful. And this is not a complete list. There's other things that you want to make sure you do within this, but these are some of the high level dimensions that we want to make sure we address. So here's where we look at, organizational readiness is what I was just talking about at the top left. We talked about alignment of executives and stakeholders. I'm just kind of moving top row left to right, and I won't go through everything, but sort of work our way down. So we talked about assessing organizational readiness, aligning executives and stakeholders. We also want to mobilize internal change agents, and those are the people that are going to actually go back to the organization and start to communicate changes and do the two-way communication, capture concerns from the organization, share what the changes are. And usually those change agents are part of the team. They're shoulder to shoulder with the frontline people. And so they become the people that are sort of the conduit or the connection between the project team and the core change management team and the rest of the organization. So they're the ones that can sort of speak the language of both the project team and the day-to-day frontline employees. You want to develop and execute a communications plan, assess and deploy change impacts. That's a big deal. When you look at how someone's job is going to change, how a business process is going to change, you want to define what the change impacts are and start to communicate that as soon as you can, so that you can, again, work through those freak out moments now. If your go live is, say, 9 months from now, and you can start to get people to freak out and work through it now, you might as well do it now instead of waiting 8 months right before go live. Start working through that now, so that by the time you get to end user training, they've already freaked out, they've calmed down, they kind of get it, they understand. Now it's just a matter of show me how to use the technology to do the things you already told me I'm going to do. So that's part of what the change impacts are and what's so important there. You want to design and deploy organizational changes. And a lot of times too, by the way, you start to make process and organizational changes that you don't need to wait till go live. If you can start sort of spoon feeding and incrementally implementing process changes, procedural changes, organizational changes, start to shift roles around, that sort of thing. If you can do that now while you're implementing, that's ideal, because then you're sort of speeding up the change management, and you're not waiting until day one of go live to spring all those changes all at once on everyone. So if you can design and deploy organizational changes throughout the implementation, that's another sort of parallel work stream that can actually speed things up quite a bit later on. So actually both those points, the organizational changes and the business process improvements, you can be doing those things early on. Anything you can do to build internal centers of excellence, to support the project, makes you less dependent on the technology vendors and that sort of thing. That's super important too. One of the other things that you'll see here is customizing ERP software training. So if you're deploying ERP software or any technology, you want to customize that training for your organization. Most of the time, most software vendors don't have time or the capacity or resources to create tailored training materials by industry and by different types of configurations and things of that nature. So it's incumbent on you, the project team, to customize that training. And typically that is not included in a software vendor's proposal. Usually they're going to say, okay, we've got our boilerplate training materials. We're going to come train your team. Your team's going to go sort of translate that into your operational reality and go do it. Well, that takes a lot of time to customize that training, so that if you're doing a training scenario, you don't, and let's just say you manufacture, high tech semiconductors, but the boilerplate training materials are using, building a bicycle or, building a widget as the example in the training material. That's not going to make sense to your organization. You need to see how you're going to build semiconductors and all the stuff that goes into that, and specific to how you're configuring that software and deploying that software and using that software. So customizing ERP software training is one of those really big hidden costs, and it's a really big part of the hidden iceberg of software implementation time, cost, resource, and risk. So that's a really important one. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is the bottom few boxes are about sort of that implementation and post-implementation, where you focus on benefits realization and how to make sure that you are getting the most value out of the organization. Because too often organizations, you sort of stop at go live. They stop, they did the training, they make sure that everyone's passed the training or whatever, make sure that people are actually able to survive and do their jobs, and then they move on to the next phase of the project. And what's really important is to recognize that you're not going to get optimal business benefits on day one or even day 30 or day 60. It's usually going to take, several weeks or months to get people up to that optimal level, not only because it takes them time to learn the system and get used to it, but also because you're going to want to make changes post-implementation. You're going to identify those things that weren't ideal during implementation. You might need to reconfigure some stuff. You might need to integrate some things that weren't integrated. You might need to clean up data. You might need to retrain people, do some refresher training, redefine a process, whatever. There's all these different things that you need to be doing. And that's just part of the normal process. You hope to work through most of that. But if you can do that earlier on, or do that as part of your go live strategy, that's going to be super important. Now that we understand some of the core strategies, the fundamental strategies that are important to affecting change within an organization, let's talk about how to build a change management plan. I want to talk more specifically about how to build that plan, what some of the major components are, and how we can start to convert that change strategy that we've defined in the previous section into something more actionable.
Now, the first of these 5 steps in deploying a change strategy is to conduct a change readiness assessment. And a lot of organizations tend to think that, yes, we're ready for change. We know that we need to change, so there's no point in doing a change readiness assessment. A change readiness assessment is not meant to determine whether or not you're ready. It's to determine how ready you are, and more importantly, to anticipate where the potential pockets of resistance might come as you go through a digital transformation. So you think about the things that are going to entail change in your organization, things like process improvements, organizational restructuring, certainly new tools and systems that you might start to use. And you combine that with the culture of your organization and past change history and your management style, leadership style, all the different things that make you who you are. And inevitably, those things all combine to create some sort of unintended resistance to change. And the key with the change readiness assessment is to dive into and proactively address what the potential resistance to change is going to be. So a way to reframe the question is not to ask yourself whether or not people will resist change, but to ask yourself, how will people resist change? How severe will that resistance be? And what will the root causes of that resistance be? No matter how well-intended your people are, which I have no doubt they are well-intended, they are going to resist change, not because they're bad people or they're trying to sabotage the project, but because you're imposing change that's going to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt within their personal lives. So the key is to recognize and understand that and do a change readiness assessment to dive into that and anticipate where those sources of resistance might come from. Now, when we do change readiness assessments for organizations, both at the beginning of a project, but also ongoing throughout a transformation, we'll start with a two-pronged change readiness approach. One is an online anonymous tool that we deploy to people to capture quantitative information and quantitative data points around the culture of the organization, the management style, the collaboration style, the communication style, all the things that tell us who the organization is and allows us to understand where the dark sides might be and the pockets of resistance might be. The second prong that we deploy is a qualitative series of focus groups where we dive deeper into an understanding of the culture of the organization and some more of the qualitative nuances of the organization so that we can combine those qualitative and quantitative data sets to anticipate and mitigate those potential sources of resistance. So this change readiness assessment is one of the first steps, if not the first step, that you should take in a change management initiative to ensure that you understand the lay of the land so you can create a change strategy that best aligns with and addresses those things that you've identified in the assessment. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for a digital transformation to succeed if your executives are not aligned and if your overall organization is not aligned. And when I talk about alignment, you may wonder, what does that mean? What does it mean to be aligned? Well, essentially it means to be on the same page, to be rowing in the same direction, to have the same vision, to have the same understanding of where we're going as an organization. Now, every organization has levels of misalignment. As you grow and as you add people and you bring in different personalities from the outside, it's inevitable that the organization is going to become somewhat misaligned. So that's the reality of a growing organization, especially a larger, more complex organization. So while we may not be able to change that reality, what we can do is understand where the executives and the overall organization is not aligned and work to get alignment on where the organization is headed. So let's just use as an example a case study from a recent client of ours. We have a client that grew very aggressively through mergers and acquisitions. They acquired over 40 different companies over the course of less than 5 years. And they came to us and said, hey, we want some help coming up with a digital strategy and executing a digital strategy that allows us to create a common set of business processes, a common operating model, a shared services model, and a way to really create one company and take these 40 different companies and start acting like one global company. Sounds simple enough and straightforward enough, but when it came to the details of what exactly that meant and some of the tough decisions that needed to be made around what it means to look like a single company in a common operating model, that's where the executives disagreed. They couldn't agree on what exactly that broad statement meant to act like one company. And until they agreed on that, they weren't able to successfully move forward with the transformation. And if you think about it, if the executives aren't aligned on what the overall vision and the strategy is going to be, the rest of the organization is not going to be aligned either. So it's very important that you spend time working with executives to ensure that they get aligned. And for more information and more details on how we approach executive alignment, I encourage you to check out this deep dive video on my YouTube channel that dives into that topic in a little bit more detail, gives you a framework for how you might deploy that within your organization. The third and most important step in a change strategy is to do a change impact assessment. And a change impact assessment is essentially looking at where you are today, where you're headed in the future, or where you plan to be in the future with your change initiative, and identifying all the gaps and the differences between current state and future state. And we need to do that not just at a global macro level, but also at an individual department, individual business unit, and in some cases, even individual people level. So in other words, if I'm an employee within an organization going through a change, I need to understand what exactly this means to me and my job. I care to some degree about what it means to the overall organization, even if I'm on board with why we're going through the change, I can't be on board with it fully until I understand what the change means to me and until I'm comfortable with that change. So the point of the change impact assessment is to really identify and fine tune and get down to a micro level of how the changes are going to impact the organization so that we can start to work through those changes with people. And the other beauty of doing a change impact assessment is that it brings some of those change freak out moments earlier in the project. In other words, we're not waiting until we get to classroom-based training where we're training people on how to use a new system. We're not waiting until them to spring a bunch of changes on them and surprise them with a bunch of changes to their jobs. That stuff's already been worked through earlier in the process through these change impact assessments. The sooner we do the change impact assessment, the sooner we're able to work through that communication and that sort of pre-training to help people understand how their roles and responsibilities are going to change and making sure we get on the same page with that. And you have to give people a chance to freak out because they will freak out when they learn that they're going to lose their spreadsheet or they're going to materially change their jobs or AI is going to automate part of their jobs. So really understanding that impact and articulating that impact is very important. Now, a word of warning here is a lot of organizations and project teams tend to overlook this step because they think they just need to focus on the future state. They're so focused on designing the new processes and the new technologies. The software vendor is pushing hard to deploy new technologies within the organization, and they tend to overlook the reality of the human dimension of change. And the change impact assessment is critical, and it's a key foundational aspect of downstream change management activities. When we look at how disruptive technology can be and how much of a game changer technology can be to organizations today, we have to recognize that there's a dark side to that game-changing ability of technology. And when I say there's a dark side, I mean that it affects humans more than it ever has in the past. People's jobs are going to change. The way they do their jobs are going to change. All these are things that affect us as humans, and these are the things that we need to work through as part of our change strategy. So just to give you an example here, if we say that we're going to deploy artificial intelligence tools to automate a certain percentage of my job, what I need to know is what am I going to do with that part of my job that is now automated? It's not enough to tell me that you're going to automate 30 or 40% of my job with AI tools that make my job easier. But the reality is that I'm going to panic a little bit when you tell me that you're going to automate 30 to 40% of my job, because what am I going to do? Are you going to get rid of my job? Are you going to replace me with someone else? Are you now not going to value me as much because you don't rely on my heroics the same way you may have in the past to work through some of these process inefficiencies that we've always had? Those are the types of things in the human psychology that need to be understood when you're going through a digital transformation like this. And so what we need to do is not just say, Eric, we're going to automate 30% of your job and make 30% of your job easier. We have to clearly articulate what my job looks like and what that organizational and job design is going to be going forward. It may also mean that we are going to restructure the way I report to people, the way I collaborate with people, the way I do my own job. And so my entire job is changing. And so that organizational design aspect of change management becomes absolutely critical. And it's another one of those underrated, overlooked things within change management, because so many times we want to focus on the end state. Let's just put new technologies and tools in place. People are going to love it. Don't worry. And let's go ahead and train them on these new technologies and tools and go live. But the reality is we're deploying technologies to make our organizations more successful, more efficient, more profitable, and we're doing it to make our teams more effective. So we have to define how is it we're making our teams more effective. Just putting the technology in place is not enough. We have to define what the organization looks like and what the job roles and responsibilities are going to look like going forward. So it's very important not to overlook organizational design and make sure that organizational design is one of your top 5 steps to an effective change strategy. A fifth important step to organizational change management is one that doesn't sound like it has anything to do with organizational change management, but it has a lot to do with it. And that is benefits realization or value realization, depending on what kind of term you want to use. But in essence, what we're saying is, how do we realize the potential value of all the technology and process improvements that we're investing in as an organization? And it's not enough just to put in new technology. The benefits and the value will not just automatically come because we put new tools in place. They come because we've managed the benefits, we've managed the value optimization of the project. So benefits realization starts with a business case. And I think most organizations understand, and most project teams understand the value of creating a business case, largely because they have to do it to justify the project. They have to determine whether or not there's an ROI in the investment they're about to make. But oftentimes what we do is we set that business case aside once we get approval, we let it collect dust on a shelf, and we go forward with our digital transformation. The more successful organizations and the more successful change initiatives will take that same business case and use that as a benefits realization tool and a value optimization tool to ensure that we're managing to those benefits and realizing the benefits over time. And the scary part about it that leads a lot of people to just forget about benefits realization is that when you go through a benefits realization exercise, you will inevitably find that you're not realizing the business value you expected as fast as you thought you would. And that's okay. It's better to understand that, recognize that, and do something about it rather than setting it aside and just hoping the problem goes away. So we want to make sure that we use benefits realization to optimize benefits after the fact. And the way we do that is we go back and measure and look at how much business value are we actually getting now that we've gone live with new technologies, and how can we optimize that longer term. And that may come in the form of process improvements or retraining, refresher training for the team. It could be that we reconfigure or redeploy technologies in a different way than we originally did. So it's a way to be agile and to fine-tune the implementation and all the time and money we've just spent on that deployment. The other way that benefits realization helps is even shorter term than that. It helps us have somewhat of a North Star and a guiding light in our digital transformation so that we can make better decisions when it comes to potential scope increases or additional modules or deployments of different types of technologies. Now we can make more informed ROI-based decisions on whether or not it adds business value to our organization, and it'll help us from a project governance perspective as well. So there's a whole host of reasons why you want to use benefits realization and leverage that work stream within your change management strategy and plan.
Now that we understand the strategy and plan behind change management, now it's important to look at what sorts of things might you face, what sorts of symptoms and challenges and points of resistance might you face along the way. What is change resistance? How do we overcome that resistance? So we're going to get a little bit deeper into the psychology of human reactions to change, and this is really going to help bring to life some of the topics that we just discussed in the previous sections as it relates to developing a strategy and a plan within the world of change management. So in this section, I want to talk about what those sources of resistance are and how you can uncover those sources of resistance within your organization. First reason why people oftentimes resist change is because they don't understand the why of the transformation. They don't understand why we're going through this digital transformation, why we need new technologies, why we need to get rid of those old spreadsheets, why you need to rely less on my heroics and my individual capabilities and more on technology that might be able to automate some of those things. So that's the why that we need to understand as a team and as an organization. If we don't understand that, then we're not going to buy into and accept the change. It has to have meaning. And not only meaning for the entire organization in terms of why is the company going through this, but also how does this benefit you as an individual? And typically 80 or 90% of the time for most people within an organization, there is an immediate benefit. There are some exceptions where some parts of the organization aren't going to benefit. In fact, it might actually make their jobs more difficult, but for the most part, for the 80 or 90% where this is true, there generally is a what's in it for me, and that's something that you need to address as part of your change strategy. But first and foremost, it's important to understand the why of change and make sure that people in your organization understand that as well. The next reason why people oftentimes resist change is because they feel like it's being forced upon them. They feel like they have no say in it. They feel like this is just happening to them. They feel like their world is being disrupted. There's some sort of outside force to disrupt their day-to-day status quo. And that creates fear, which then leads to resistance to change. Now, this is a difficult one to navigate because on one hand, in today's day and age, we all are facing forced changes. In a post-pandemic world, many of us were forced to change the way we work or where we work or how we use technologies, how we interact with customers, how we interact with people in person or not. A lot of changes along those lines. And so change has been thrust upon us, and we haven't had a lot of choice in terms of whether or not we accept change going forward. So while on one hand it can be helpful to have that sort of burning platform, that really good reason why we need to change, on the other hand, you can't just cram it down people's throats for the most part. Most organizations assume that people are just going to accept change because you tell them that they have to. But the reality is most organizations and most cultures throughout the world don't respond positively to just forcing change upon the organization. So one thing to consider is how can we create more of a perception that this change is not being forced upon people, but rather they're part of the change. They come along for the journey, they're part of the vision, they're part of the execution of defining and executing what the changes are. And how can we do that in a way that creates that buy-in and ownership for the change rather than making it feel like it's being forced upon them. The next thing to consider is the sheer volume of change that organizations and people are going through in general. You have on one hand a post-pandemic world where people's worlds have been disrupted, the way they work, the health and safety regulations they need to follow, even where they work, if they have to work remotely or they need to change the physical configuration of how they work. Those are big changes for a lot of people that have been forced upon a lot of organizations. Then you add to that the fact that supply chains are being disrupted. Technology is changing at a rapid pace. Your business is changing at a rapid pace. Your customers and their needs are changing at a rapid pace, which is all creating a high volume of change within the organization as it is. Now you throw on top of all that a digital transformation, which is even more change, and that sheer volume of change can be overwhelming for people. And even if you just look at a digital transformation, the sheer volume of change just within a digital transformation is pretty significant. You have not just technology change, but you have more importantly and more significantly business process changes, roles and responsibility changes, oftentimes business model changes, oftentimes reporting relationships are changing, you're doing a restructuring as part of the transformation, etc. So it's really important to empathize with that and understand that people in general within most organizations, especially if they're going through digital transformations, are going through a sheer high volume of change that can be overwhelming. And at some point they'll suffer from change fatigue and they just simply can't take on or adapt to any more change. So we have to really make sure we're operating with two things in mind. One is operating at the right tempo that allows us to marinate the change within the organization. And then the second thing is to make sure you have a change management strategy and plan that accurately reflects your culture, your specific resistance to change, your individuals, your different work groups within the organization, and make sure that you have a clear plan to mitigate and neutralize that resistance to change. And all of this, of course, should keep in mind that organizations and people as humans are dealing with a huge amount of change right now. Now, the one source of resistance to change that I actually think is the biggest source and the most meaningful one is the fact that people oftentimes perceive threat when they think about change. For example, if you have an employee who built a really complex spreadsheet that they've used for years to manage their function, their operations, their part of the business, and the organization relies on that person to jockey that Excel spreadsheet and to analyze and to spit out the data that's required to make meaningful decisions, that's a point of pride and a point of heroics for a lot of individuals. Whether it's right or wrong, whether it's the right or most efficient way to do business is a different story, but the fact of the matter is that individual likely feels a certain sense of pride that is now going to be disrupted by the fact that you're talking about potentially automating that spreadsheet. And this is just one microscopic example within an organization that might have hundreds or thousands of employees, so you can only imagine how many examples of this little specific case study that you might find within your organization. So when thinking about resistance to change, it's important to think about it from the context of unintentional resistance. Most people within organizations aren't resisting change because they want to be difficult or they want to sabotage the project or they don't want to do what's best for the organization. They do it because they're at a more fundamental base point of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is survival. And they're trying to survive in their jobs, and you're telling them that you're going to jeopardize their job, or so it's perceived. So that's something you really have to work through and make sure that people understand how their jobs are going to be affected, what's expected of them going forward, why we're going through the change, and more importantly, and most importantly, how they are still going to be a huge amount of value to the organization going forward, even if it might look a little bit different and it might be a little bit outside of their comfort zone. But by having open and honest dialogues like that and clearly articulating and defining how people's jobs are going to change and how they're going to add value going forward, that helps neutralize these perceived threats and these sources of unintentional resistance. So be sure you identify what those perceived threats are and deal with those head on, and don't just sweep them under the rug or assume that they'll go away because you put out a project newsletter or you send out a few emails. There's a lot more to it from a change management and strategy perspective to address that. Just building on the last point about perceived threats and unintentional resistance, there's a whole concept of providing a clarity of job roles. So in other words, as people look to the future state and you look to what your future state business processes and technologies are going to be, you're inevitably going to be changing the way people do their jobs. Their roles and responsibilities might change. Their job descriptions might change. They might have new reporting relationships. You might take away part of their job. You might automate part of their job. So it's really important to understand what those changes are and articulate what those jobs are going to look like in the future so that you can start communicating prior to going live with new technology. You're communicating to people how their jobs are going to look, what the job design and the organizational design is going to be, how they fit into the overall big picture, why we're doing it. All that good stuff needs to be addressed as part of your change management strategy. Now, the final point I'll make here in this discussion is arguably the one that starts the earliest but doesn't get perceived or identified until later in a transformation, and that is this whole concept of unrealistic expectations. In other words, early in a transformation, an organization sets unrealistic expectations related to implementation time, the cost, the resources required, the level of effort required, the results we're going to get out of the transformation. Those unrealistic expectations are set early on, and most organizations have unrealistic expectations before they go into their transformations, which is a big problem. Because what happens then is later on in the project, when you fail to meet those unrealistic expectations, you start to demoralize your employees and your project team and everyone throughout the organization. And that leads to resistance to change. If, for example, everyone had the expectation that this was going to be an 18-month initiative, but it turns into 36 months, in that time, from the initial 18 months to the 36 months, you're going to lose your audience. You're going to lose any sort of support you had for the project because people start to doubt and they start to become skeptical. So one of the biggest and most important things you can do early on to really strike at the heart or the root cause of resistance to change is to make sure you have realistic expectations to begin with, because that's going to save you a lot of heartburn later on when you start to see some of the resistance percolate as a result of those unrealistic expectations. So be sure you have realistic expectations going into your transformation in order to neutralize any resistance to change that might develop. There's a disconnect between what leaders think is happening with AI, what technologists think is happening with AI, versus what employees are feeling boots on the ground. And what I want to do with you today is share with you 5 lessons that we've learned from helping clients through their AI initiatives, not only from a strategy perspective, but also from a change management perspective. What are those areas of resistance that we're seeing amongst employees on the front lines, and why are they resisting it? I'll start by summarizing and saying it's not coming from a bad place. Most employees are not interested in sabotaging AI initiatives. Most employees are not interested in disrupting the flow and the evolution of your organization. And most employees are not interested in being insubordinate or refusing to follow the leadership of the organization. Instead, there are 5 basic human dynamics that are at play with how employees are resisting AI. The first is job security anxiety. When you read the headlines about what AI is going to do to society in the future, many of those headlines feature alarmist types of data suggesting that millions or maybe even tens of millions of jobs might be lost or displaced or somehow negatively impacted in the long term. So regardless of whether or not this is the case with your organization or the intent of your organization, people's mindset focuses on some of those headline news articles that they see in mainstream media. And this may turn out to materialize as well, but it's not even a matter of whether or not the alarmists are right and AI becomes a replacement for human jobs in the future. The fact of the matter is people perceive that it might, and that fear and uncertainty is what creates doubt when it comes to job security. A second reason why employees are resisting AI is because AI in many cases is being introduced without purpose. There's just pressure to introduce AI to the organization. A lot of times the board of directors and the shareholders of the organization are pushing management teams to adopt AI because they know long-term AI may and very well likely could improve the productivity and effectiveness and cost structure of organizations longer term. Now, of course, this ties back to the first fear that employees have, is that they fear their job loss and their job security, but it also, beyond that, creates a lack of certainty around why the organization is going through the project, why they're deploying AI, and what they expect the organization to look like after they use AI within the organization. The third reason why employees are resisting AI in many organizations we work with is because leaders oftentimes put tools before trust, and they put the technology first, and the human part and the operational part they decide they want to figure out later. And this is understandable in some ways because AI is new. A lot of us are still uncertain as to how AI is going to change and impact our operations, so we don't have a lot of those answers. But when we don't have those answers as leaders, employees are going to have a hard time following if they don't have clarity and understanding of why we're deploying AI and what we hope to accomplish from it. So this is why it's so important to have a clear vision and a clear direction for what it is you hope to get out of your AI initiative. A fourth reason why employees are resisting AI is because there's a lack of certainty on how AI will affect their individual careers. I talked before about short-term job security being a concern for employees, but even beyond that, what does AI mean for their jobs going forward? How are they going to upskill themselves and become more relevant in today's AI-driven society? A lot of organizations are focusing on implementing that technology without necessarily investing in the people side of understanding how AI can be used and the people side of understanding the technological aspects of AI. So in the absence of that understanding, people are not going to feel confident in their jobs, and they're not going to know exactly how their career will unfold at your company and potentially future employers going forward. A fifth reason why employees are resisting AI on the front lines is because of change fatigue. Organizations have gone through a significant amount of technological change and operational change, and in many cases, organizational change in recent years, going back to COVID and even before COVID. Organizations have had to deal with a lot, and employees have had to deal with a lot. Technology has changed. A lot of organizations have moved to the cloud. A lot of organizations have been re-engineering their business processes and addressing other technological initiatives. And at some point, there's a breaking point where employees just can't consume and handle more change and still do their day-to-day jobs. So the change fatigue that many organizations are experiencing right now, especially in the face of economic uncertainty and globalization and other factors outside the realm of your technology project, you add all this up and you have a perfect storm and a backdrop of where employees start to resist further change because they can only handle so much change. So given the fact that AI is evolving so fast and disrupting organizations in mostly a positive way, potentially, it's also creating short-term negative disruption as it relates to employees. And it's important to understand these 5 reasons I've talked about here today on why employees are resisting that change. But what I want to do next is unpack these 5 things a little bit more and talk about why this resistance is actually rational. And more importantly, stay tuned to the end of the video because I'll share some tips on how to overcome this resistance. So resistance to change as it relates to AI amongst employees is something that may sound like a negative thing or a bad thing. But I want to summarize and start off by saying most of the time employees is not coming from a bad place when they resist change to AI or any other technology. Most of the time, there's a good human basic instinct that feeds into that. For many, having skepticism around AI is not pure sabotage, it's more of a survival strategy. It's trying to understand and make sense of the world around them. When you have all these media outlets talking incessantly about AI and how great it is and how profitable it's going to make companies and how many jobs can be saved at all these different companies, it's understandable why people would wonder if AI really is a good thing for them, especially at an individual level. So they may not be leading with negativity, but something that's meant to be positive ends up becoming a negative thing when they don't have that certainty and understanding of why the organization is going through the process. The other source of resistance and the other human behavior aspect of resistance to AI is the fact that people have learned from past transformations that their organization has been through. If your organization has failed in past attempts to implement ERP or other types of enterprise technologies, or if you've just had troubled attempts along the way and it's been a pretty messy process, employees remember that. They have long-term memories and they remember the pain that the organization went through because in many cases they were part of that pain and they were direct recipients of that pain. So now when you throw in a new technology that's still not quite mature, it's still not proven, it still hasn't been widely accepted by most organizations, you can see why employees wonder if this is really a good thing and they're trying to make sense of it all. And third, another reason why I'd say resistance to AI is rational is because so many organizations are using AI very tactically at this point. A lot of them are still testing and piloting and trying to figure out how could AI help our business, and they don't necessarily have a bigger picture, overarching strategy of how they're going to deploy AI and other technologies. So that's understandable from a leadership perspective, but you have to recognize that that uncertainty at the leadership level, that uncertainty around how AI is going to be used in your organization creates uncertainty with employees, which then translates to resistance. So now that we've talked about some of the reasons why human behavior is natural and the resistance to AI is natural and understandable, let's shift gears and talk about what you can do about it to give yourself a better chance to succeed with your AI initiatives going forward. So what are leaders missing when they try to lead their employees through change? What are they missing that's causing employees to resist change? Well, first of all, I'd say it's not what you're doing necessarily that's causing employees to resist AI. It's what you're not doing. So let's talk about the things you can do. And let's also talk about the things that you should do less of as well. The first is to view AI as an organizational change initiative, not a technology initiative. It's really important to understand that yes, AI is a really cool technology. It's very advanced, it's very sophisticated, becoming very sophisticated. It's exciting in many cases. It still should be treated as an organizational initiative. It should not lead the change. It should enable whatever changes you're trying to accomplish. So if you're trying to be more efficient, if you're trying to provide better customer service, if you're trying to build better products, whatever the case may be, that should be the driving factor with AI supporting. So that gives you a sense of purpose and it gives your employees a sense of purpose that's easier to follow than just let's go implement AI and see what happens. Second is that adoption is emotional and leaders need to understand that. Employees follow and they embrace new technologies and they want to support change initiatives when they understand what's happening, when they feel secure, and when the emotions are positive for them. The minute those emotions turn negative or come from a place of uncertainty, fear, or doubt, that's where people start to resist change. So as a leader, one question to ask yourself is, how can I lead this change in a way that gets rid of that FUD, that fear, uncertainty, and doubt? And how can we translate that negative emotion into something more positive, something that gets them excited, something that helps them see the vision of what the future can be for the organization, but more importantly, what's in it for them? How will it help their career? How will it help them be better at their jobs day to day? How will it give them the confidence to navigate this future of work that we're embracing at the moment? So these are all things you've got to think about as a leader, and things that you can do to help ensure that your people do ultimately follow. A third thing that leaders can do to help ensure that people follow AI initiatives and strategies is to involve them in use case definition. Involve your employees in trying to pilot ideas or to test AI in certain parts of their business. Perhaps you have different work groups that you task them with finding one of the biggest challenges they're facing, one of the biggest inefficiencies or pain points for their part of the organization, and invite them to come up with ideas on how they could use AI to potentially solve those problems. And the minute you get those people involved in the decision process and in the piloting process, the minute you do two things. One is you get a lot of good ideas from the front lines that you probably wouldn't have thought of inside the boardroom or from an ivory tower. But secondly, now you've gotten their buy-in. They are part of the solution, and they feel a lot more confident. They feel like they have ownership, and they're not threatened by the change, and the change isn't just happening to them. So it's really a win-win across the board. It's good for the organization, it's good for you as a leader, and it's good for the employees on the front lines as well. And then finally, even though AI is a big unknown and you're probably trying to figure out a lot of details around what AI can and can't do, it's important to measure success not in terms of the technology, but in the adoption. How many employees are using AI? What's the success rate? What's the impact to the business? How is it affecting their job satisfaction? Really measuring and understanding how AI is affecting the organization as a whole and as individual work groups and also individual people, that's something that will go a long way towards building confidence and getting people to turn a negative emotion, a resistance-based emotion, into something that's more focused on being a part of the solution and being excited about the solution. At the end of the day, if I were to leave you with one piece of advice, it'd be that you need to remember that AI strategies are not going to fail because of the technology itself. AI is evolving, it's advancing very quickly. It's still not perfect. There's still imperfections and hallucinations and other things we've got to worry about. Data governance is still important. The technology itself needs attention, but at the end of the day, the more you can focus on the people side of the equation, the more successful these initiatives are going to be, and the less likely it is that people are going to resist the change and feel threatened by the changes. Because remember, employees typically aren't going to resist change in the form of open rebellion and protest. They're going to do it quietly, they're going to do it behind the scenes, under the radar, and they're going to do it behind closed doors, and that's the hard change resistance to overcome. When leaders in project teams embark on transformation initiatives, they commonly make a number of people-related mistakes related to organizational change management or a lack thereof, a blind spot within the realm of change management. So what I want to do today is talk about some of those most common mistakes and pitfalls that we see from a change management perspective. Let's start with the most dangerous change management trap, and this is one that starts at the top of your organization. The common leadership trap that we see here is that leaders will say they support change, but they don't actually lead the change, and they're not actually engaged with it. Instead, what happens is leaders will oftentimes delegate change to other people. They'll delegate it to the project manager, they might delegate it to the project team, or they might delegate it to a change lead and assume that those people will handle the change for them. Well, the reality is that leaders need to be the ones to drive the changes and to be the face of changes and to make those ultimate uncomfortable decisions that every leader has to make during a digital transformation. Some leaders think that they just show up to the project kickoff. They might show up at certain milestones. They'll send out a few emails. They'll mention the project and how great it's going in all company meetings. They might show up for the go live celebration. That's all important stuff. You need to be present, but there's a lot more to providing strong leadership that's required for these sorts of projects. Real change and strong leadership requires constant messaging. It requires visibility, but more importantly, it requires strong and decisive decision making. These sorts of projects are difficult. There's a lot of trade-offs that need to be made during a digital transformation, and it's the leadership that has to make those decisions. A lot of times, leaders will think they can just defer to what the technology can or can't do. They'll defer to the technologists or the software vendor or the system integrator to tell them how to run their business. And this is a terrible idea. This is the exact opposite of what strong leadership entails. My team and I have been involved with hundreds of different digital transformations, and the strongest leaders, the most effective leaders we've seen are the ones that get their hands dirty and they get involved in making key decisions of what their business is going to look like in the future. Now, they don't necessarily need to micromanage. They don't necessarily need to be involved in every single meeting and design decision that's made. They don't have time for that, and they probably don't have the right skill set for that anyway. But what they do need to do is make the high-level strategic decisions that are so important to the project. But what too often happens is that these leaders will defer to outside third parties to make the decisions for them. Then they wonder why their teams are resisting change and why the change isn't sticking. Well, the reason that is because the change didn't come from within, it came from someone outside the organization. So strong leadership is required, and it's important for your leadership team to understand what strong leadership looks like. And one rule of thumb here is that if the leadership team isn't slightly uncomfortable throughout the entire digital transformation, then they're probably not doing their job and they're not making the decisions that they need to make, because these decisions are very difficult. And when the leadership team doesn't lead the change and make these tough decisions, what happens then is that change resistance will fill that void, and that's what I'll talk about later in this video. Oftentimes, organizations view resistance to change as something that needs to be suppressed, something that needs to be managed. And actually, that's the wrong way of thinking about it. The way resistance to change should be thought about is it's a signal, it's a symptom of something deeper. It means that people aren't on board with the changes that are happening. It means maybe they don't understand the changes. It means that perhaps they are threatened by the changes. I'll give you a common example we see with a lot of very well-intended employees within our client base, and that is that some of these highly tenured employees have grown up in a world within your organization where they've had limited technology, they've had broken processes, broken data, broken technologies in general, and they've had to power through with heroics and tribal knowledge. Now, when a digital transformation happens, that threatens their sense of purpose and meaning within the organization. After all, they've built their entire career on powering through despite having poor technology and poor tools to support them. They've been able to power through, which is a testament to them, their fortitude and their talents. So when you talk about automating their jobs or introducing AI to do a large part of their jobs for them, or technology to automate a large part of what they've done, that might be the right thing for the business, and it might be ultimately what you do as a business, but that person, that individual is going to be threatened by that change. And it's important that leaders recognize and understand that and anticipate it before the change resistance happens. Rather than suppressing it reactively later on, what organizations need to do is do an organizational readiness assessment early on in the project to understand where those pockets of resistance are likely to come from and proactively address them. And some of the best ways to address change resistance and get ahead of it before it becomes a problem is to provide clarity and help people understand what their jobs are going to look like in the future. There's nothing worse than lack of clarity. If they don't understand what they're going to do with all this time that technology is allegedly going to save them, that's going to be something that strikes fear into them, and it's going to cause them to resist change. The second proactive antidote to change resistance is to provide a reassurance that the person is still important. They will continue to use their heroics and their tribal knowledge and all these strengths and skills that they have. It's just going to look differently. And that comes back to the first point about needing to provide that clarity. So this is just one example, a couple solutions for how to attack the root cause of change resistance and to get ahead of it before it becomes a problem later on. And one last thing I'll mention here is that if you're surprised by resistance and you didn't anticipate the change resistance at any point in the project, then you haven't been paying enough attention to your people and to your project. Another common change management trap is the lack of focus trap. In other words, the organization's trying to do too much at once within their digital transformation. And this is a very common one that we see time and time again with our clients, especially when you have software vendors that are trying very hard to sell as much software as possible and to compress as much change as possible into as small of a timeline as possible. That's good for the vendor. That's going to benefit the vendor and the system integrators and the implementers, but it's not going to benefit you as an organization. Not only do you have to worry about the volume of technology that's being deployed, but more importantly, you have to think about what is the magnitude of change we're going to experience and how much change can we handle all at once. How do we need to pace ourselves? How do we need to set the right cadence, the right tempo for introducing these changes to the organization? And more often than not, the technology gets crammed into the organization faster then the organization can consume it. And that's why it's so important to focus. You need to focus on the technologies that are going to deliver the most value and focus on those first and pace yourself and make sure you're not trying to do too much at once. In addition to forcing too much technology in too little time, there's the non-technological things that oftentimes get deprioritized because technology consumes so much time and focus. There's things like the change management efforts, the process improvements and making decisions and defining what your architecture is going to be, and integration and data migration, all these different pieces of the project that oftentimes get overlooked or pushed aside because it doesn't benefit the vendor directly. And that's why that lack of focus becomes such a challenge for a lot of organizations. So the big takeaway here is that you want to make sure that you control the tempo, you manage the project, you can take inputs from your software vendor and your systems integrator, but you need to make sure that you, the leadership team, and you as a project team are defining what the project change looks like and that you define what the focus needs to be. And a little hint here is that more focus does not need to be given to technology. You probably need to take some of the attention away from technology and focus on the people and process and strategy sides of your transformation, because ultimately that's the stuff that will determine how successful your project is or isn't. Organizations often view technology initiatives as just pure technology deployments, something that people will figure out after go live, or at the very least, very close to go live. And this couldn't be further from the truth. Too often, end user training is very generic. It's not relevant to your industry, it's not relevant to your business, and it doesn't fit the way people operate and the way their jobs are designed. We'll see situations where a training team from a software vendor will try to train a manufacturer of complex products using materials that show you how to build a simple bicycle. That just doesn't resonate with end users of a very complex, highly engineered product, and they need those materials and those training and communication dimensions to focus on their jobs and their businesses. So this is why change management is so important, to ensure that you're not just doing basic training, you're actually focused on building competencies in your organization. You're building competencies on what the new processes are going to look like. You're building competencies around what the new roles are going to look like, because more than ever, enterprise technologies, especially with the advent of AI and predictive analytics and all these cool emerging technologies, more than ever, that technology is disrupting people's jobs and changing people's jobs for the better longer term in most cases, but still very difficult for people to adjust to. So we need to focus on building those competencies, not just on training someone how to do a transaction in a system. That's the easy part. The hard part is to ensure that they understand what their business processes look like and the overall competencies required to do their jobs. So this is why organizations need to spend more time on building those competencies and handling that as part of their change management initiative, even if it means redirecting resources and focus away from technology so that you can focus more time on building the internal competencies. And when this doesn't happen, what ends up happening is that employees and end users will ultimately blame the system. They'll find faults in the system, and they'll blame their lack of competency and their lack of confidence in this new environment. They'll blame that on the technology, and that will lead to even more resistance to change, and in some cases, flat out refusal to use the system, and in some cases using Excel spreadsheets and other manual workarounds. After an organization goes live with new technology, what commonly happens is that the team disbands and they go back to do their day jobs. They're exhausted, they're tired, they want to get back to what they're good at, which is doing their day-to-day jobs, and they don't take the time to optimize and learn from what has just happened and transpired. And what this leads to is a subpar implementation, where you've got technology in place that may or may not be used by the organization, and more often than not is not delivering the potential business value that organizations could be realizing from it. In a multi-phase rollout, organizations will oftentimes go live with the first phase and then just immediately go on to phase two without really taking the time to reflect and understand what went well and what could they be doing better to learn from that first phase to apply it to future phases of the project. Both of these situations are difficult. Both of them are problems, and organizations don't spend nearly enough time optimizing and learning from what has happened throughout the project. With as fast as technology is changing and as difficult as organizations already have keeping up with these technological changes, this becomes even more important in the 2020s where we are today. And the key lesson here is that your go live is not the end goal, or it should not be the end goal. It's not a finish line. It's an ongoing journey, and that may be the last thing some of you want to hear, especially if you're mired in the thick of a delayed project or one that never seems to end, but realistically speaking, technological change never stops, your business never stops changing, and continuously optimizing and learning is something that organizations could do a much better job of, especially as technology continues to change more and more rapidly over time. So these 5 traps are common. We see them time and time again. They're common patterns within the industry, but they're also avoidable. That's the good news. And oftentimes it starts with doing a simple organizational assessment early on in the project to understand in a sort of heat map sort of fashion how businesses are going to resist change. Where is the resistance going to come from? What are the sources of resistance? What are the challenges that this organization is likely to feel based on the culture that they have today and where they're headed in the future? Now, in this section, I want to dive into stakeholder and executive alignment. And this is something that is arguably the most important part of change management, because if you don't do this part right, all the other stuff we've talked about in this training so far, and all the stuff we have left to talk about in this training, is largely irrelevant, because it's not going to work, it's not going to be effective if you don't have that internal alignment. And oftentimes, the internal alignment or misalignment that you see within an organization is often the root cause for resistance to change and other change management obstacles and barriers that we commonly see. So I want to dive into the whole concept of internal alignment here in this section. So the first thing we need to do when driving executive alignment is to define what our corporate strategy is, and more importantly, translate that corporate strategy into a series of objectives and parameters for what this digital transformation means to the organization. So I want to visualize what I mean by that here. So let's just say you as an organization have a series of objectives. In this case, we'll just use 4 primary objectives. This is objective number 1. That might be to standardize and scale the company, or to act more like one company and act less decentralized and less fragmented and siloed than maybe we have in the past. That might be the first objective. And then we'll have a series of other objectives that we as an organization are trying to accomplish as part of our 3 to 5 to 10 year strategy and plan. Now, most organizations have a good handle on this layer right here. We find that most companies kind of know intuitively, or perhaps they've documented clearly what their vision, strategy, and objectives are as an organization. Where we run into trouble, though, is when we move down to a digital transformation. And we'll call this right here, this is the layer, we'll just call digital transformation, ERP, HCM, CRM, whatever you want to call it, or whatever your digital transformation entails. And oftentimes what happens is you see that this is clearly defined, we're chugging along in a clear direction here, but when we get to here, there's a misalignment here that's breaking that connection between the overall objectives and strategy of the organization and the strategy and objectives of the digital transformation. So what we need to do as a first step, and this is step number 1 in the whole process here, is to define how do we translate these objectives into digital transformation objectives. So in the case of this objective here for the organization that is trying to standardize operations, create a common operating model across a multinational organization, perhaps they're trying to act more like one company and act like one common face to their customer base globally, that's going to drive or translate to some parameters for your digital transformation. An example here to continue with that would be that's probably going to lead us more to finding a single ERP system that the entire globe uses. If our goal was to do the opposite and remain decentralized and act independently and act as disparate companies and in the name of flexibility, that might lead us to more of a best of breed model. So we're not getting quite into software selection yet. We're not evaluating systems. We're not identifying specific vendors yet, but we're defining what the parameters for this digital transformation should be. And that's an important part, is translating these objectives into specific objectives for the digital transformation. So once we've identified the objectives of the digital transformation, we have a clear vision of how we articulate our overall corporate objectives into digital transformation objectives and goals. Now it's time for us to identify alternatives. And this is where the love and logic concept comes into play. And I'll describe what I mean by that here in just a second. So we're identifying alternatives here. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of the types of alternatives we might describe. So I already described one of them, and think of these all as not an either-or decision, but more of a spectrum that needs to be defined. One decision would be centralized versus decentralized. So think of this as a spectrum here. This is not an either-or decision, but it's a spectrum that we're going to fall on. And what we need to figure out going forward is how centralized do we want to be, or how decentralized do we want to be as an organization? And again, hopefully we've started to articulate some of this up here in our strategic articulation. Another example would be big change versus incremental change. So we'll call it the degree of change spectrum here. So we'll say big changes. And it's not that they're small changes, I suppose, it's more that they're incremental changes. For some organizations, they really want to swing for the fences. They want to have a massive transformation, sometimes to be strategic and to get ahead of the competition, and other times it's because their industry is being disrupted. Retail is a great example. It's a common example of a company that they don't really have a choice, that it's not really an option for them to incrementally change. If they want to compete with Amazon and other e-commerce providers, they're going to have to go for big changes. Other companies will do so more strategically. So we want to figure out where on the spectrum do we fall, and a lot of this has to do with what our strategy is going to be, but also what our risk tolerance is. For a very conservative organization that historically doesn't like to take big risks, or maybe they've failed in the past in big transformation efforts, they may be more down on this side of the spectrum. Other organizations that have a higher risk tolerance, or they are more confident in their ability to manage those risks, they might be more on the left side of the spectrum here. And a third example of many, there's a whole plethora of things we usually help our clients define in terms of these alternatives, is going to be how much of this project do we insource versus outsource. And most companies are somewhere in the middle or some sort of hybrid, but there's different extremes here, of course, in terms of how organizations handle this. So some companies opt to outsource their entire transformation to a system integrator or consultants. Others decide to take it all in-house because they have the competency and the ability to handle it. Most organizations end up somewhere in the middle. But regardless, we want to see where on the spectrum we fall. So these are just 3 examples of many that we look at in terms of what are our alternatives. So now that we've defined what our alternatives are, and in our example here we have 3 basic examples, we need to drive a decision and look at where we stand as an organization or as a team. So one thing we do when we're facilitating this process with clients is we'll meet with executive teams and we'll define a 2 color-coded approach to where they are today and where they're headed. So what we'll typically do is we'll use red to visualize where the different executives on the team fall on the spectrum. So if we're looking at our current state, it may be that these are individual perceptions of where we stand as an organization. Everything in red here, I'm just randomly doing this for illustrative purposes. You can see that most of them are kind of clustered over here toward decentralized. This is where we are today, not necessarily where we're going in the future, but where we are today. At the same time, or after we've identified where people's perceptions are of where we are today, we then shift gears to talk about where is it we want to go in the future. And as part of that conversation, we're also educating the executives of, we can move wherever we want on the spectrum, but we have to understand that there's trade-offs. There's no silver bullet, there's risks, there's going to be problems that come along with that, and we've got to be comfortable with that, and we need to know that we can handle those risks. So that's, again, where this whole love and logic concept comes in, that we don't want to give the executives an easy way out. We don't want to give them a silver bullet. We don't want to give them unrealistic expectations. We want to be brutally honest about what those trade-offs are. Once we've done that, then we come back to the team and say, based on what we know about those trade-offs, where do we think we want to head with this transformation in the future? And let's just say that as this example, using green as the color that we use to color code the future state, we find that most executives are kind of leaning this direction, but they're also a little bit scattered. There's no clear, easy, definitive answer. I know that's a little bit difficult to read with the bleeding of the colors here, but hopefully it makes sense that what we're seeing here are 2 things. One is that we see a clear shift from the red that we're leaning this way. Now we're shifting slightly this way to green. So that's telling us that we're dealing with an executive team that wants to move clearly to more of a centralized fashion. What we also see is that we're not aligned. So even though the average is kind of leaning this way on the future state, the average is leaning this way on the current state, and usually, by the way, we're usually more aligned on what the current state is because it's reality, it's what it is today, and it's less open to interpretation. And usually you see that there's less alignment in our definition of the future state. So in this example, where you see green that's kind of leaning this way, but you also see some people that are still over here in the decentralized model, we know that if we move forward with our team like this, where our executive team is misaligned, we're going to have misaligned decision making that's going to trickle down to our digital transformation. So in other words, if we're not aligned up here in terms of what we want the vision for the project to be and where the company is headed, we're going to have problems down here because we're not sure what the right answers are in day-to-day decision making as it relates to the project. So that tells us one thing is that we're not aligned, and secondly, it tells us that we are moving from one side of the spectrum to another, which means there's some change that comes along with that, which means that change management is going to be extremely important for this organization in this example. So we've gone through this exercise, we've defined alternatives, we've looked at where we think we stand in the current state and the future state. We've done this not just for the one example I gave here, but for dozens of different criteria that we look at in a transformation. What do we do now? Well, now we know the lay of the land. We know where the big gaps are. We know where the landmines are. We know where we're not aligned. And we know we've got more work to do to facilitate alignment here. And a lot of times it comes down to, like I said before, education and helping executives understand what the trade-offs are, and oftentimes painting a roadmap of different options. So we could go this route, and this is what it looks like. This is what the cost profile will look like. This is what the benefits would be. This is what the risks would be. Or we could go this way and stay closer to where we are today. This is what the cost benefit looks like, what the risk profile looks like. And again, we're putting the decision squarely on the executive team to make that decision, because we cannot have the project team at the digital transformation level making that decision when the executive team isn't even aligned on what they want the organization to be when they grow up. So we repeat this process as necessary through education, facilitation, until we get comfortable that we have a common vision for what this project is going to be. And then at that point, we can move forward with defining a transformation strategy and plan in more detail, a resourcing plan, budget, all that good stuff that supports the decisions we've made here. One of the common questions we hear with clients is, this is great, we wish we would have done this from the start, and in a perfect world, you would do this before you start your digital transformation. But what if we've already headed down the path of starting the project, we've already gotten ourselves into trouble, we've already hit some speed bumps, whatever the case may be? That's okay. It's not ideal, but it's okay. We can still work around that. What we recommend in that case is, if possible, can we get alignment either in parallel with the project continuing, or do we have the luxury of time to be able to pause temporarily to get that alignment so that we can all make sure we're singing to the same choir book and we're all using the same playbook going forward? And oftentimes we find that by taking the time to pause, even though it sounds terrible, it sounds like we're slowing things down, your system integrator isn't going to like it, there's going to be a lot of people telling you not to do it, it'll actually speed things up later, because the better we can get aligned as a team before we get too far down the path, or if we already are too far down the path, if we pause to get that alignment, things are going to go much more smoothly and actually speed up later. So that's the trade-off we have to assess is it worth taking a time out to call an audible, to regroup, to revisit where we are as a team, as an organization, before we get too far further down that path. So if you are too far down that path, it's okay. There's ways around it, and I'd be happy to bounce around and brainstorm ideas. If you'd like to reach out to me, I've included my contact information below. Now in this section, I want to get into training, adoption, and sustainment. And this is one of the areas that is probably better understood among change management practitioners and even non-change management practitioners. It's something that is commonly understood. You need to train people on new technologies, new tools, new processes, etc. But how you go about it and the nuances of how you go about it is something that oftentimes gets overlooked or mistaken. So what I want to do today is show you a couple of video clips that dive into different discussions I've had with other change management team members that either work for our team or that we collaborate with outside of Third Stage, and really dive into this whole topic of how we can better ensure user adoption and training for end users and employees. We wanted to take this case study, which is interesting in a lot of ways, because a lot of times on this show and on this podcast, we'll sort of do case studies after the fact. After the project's completed, you look back and reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, what were some of the lessons learned. But this one's a little bit different because we're right in the midst of the transformation right now. So it's a little bit more of a in the trenches sort of a feel. And that's really what I wanted to get after here today. And today's discussion is sort of the good, the bad, the ugly of what's happening right now, you know, as you guys are going through this transformation with our client. So I guess just to start out, and we can't, obviously, hopefully the audience understands we can't share the client name or any sort of confidential information, but we can share a bit about the organization, some of the challenges and that sort of thing without mentioning them by name or without giving away who the organization is. But without giving away who the organization is, Nate, tell us a little bit about the clients, what it is they do, what industry they're in, that sort of thing, as well as the scope of their digital transformation, just to start us off, and then we'll kind of get into some of the change management specific questions.
Great, yeah, thanks. Our client is a $1 billion plus multinational chemical manufacturing organization, and they called us in the middle of the implementation of a tier 1 ERP platform. They have had several technology initiatives that have been very successful, some that have been very challenging. We were called in specifically for our change management expertise and to help guide them through the change management initiative and to really put in place a structured change management program and initiative to help them not only with this technology implementation, but down the road, post-implementation, go live and post-go live support.
Okay, great. That's a good overview. And so I guess just to start, again, coming at this from a change management and a human side of change perspective, how big of an impact or change is this transformation in general having on the organization? And Cameron, let's start with you. I know you guys all have opinions on all these topics, but we'll start with you, Cameron.
Well, I'd say that this organization is experiencing pretty large impact globally. It's a large solution. It's moving from an on-prem to cloud-based. There's a lot of difference in the way the system is structured and handles their current processes. So it's just very complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. And like I said, global meaning you're working with different countries with different compliance and regulatory requirements and needs, potentially different processes. And to work and manage a project of that size truly takes a strong governance structure from a project perspective in managing it. So it's a significant change to this organization.
And is that the sort of, just out of curiosity, is that that sort of project governance or the general governance that you're talking about, is that something that's new to this organization, or is that something they already had the competency and now they're just sort of building on that to make the transformation more successful?
I'd say it's a little of both. It seems that they set up the governance structures typically for their projects, but I think they've made a different focus on this one with having the change management lens. They've kind of usually been a technical driven company, and that kind of ties into the culture, right? It's where they've been. And so when Nate alluded to some of the project successes they've had and some of the we won't call them letdowns because they were successful, but as far as they completed them, but they were IT driven and they didn't have a business focus. So I think that's the key with the new governance structure, along with the fact that they've taken those past experiences and have realized the benefit of change management or change leadership, which I'm sure we'll get into a little more. And that's now a new component to this, where we're working with both the technical and the business side.
Got it. Okay. That makes total sense. So Nate and Mitch, anything you'd add to the mix as far as how big of a change or impact this has been on the organization?
The one thing that I would add in there is, coming from an environment where they have their legacy system that was completely customized to meet their needs to the out-of-the-box type of model, they're running into significant challenges in trying to fit what they've been doing for the last 10, 12, 20 years into what they're doing today with an out-of-the-box solution. So lots of processes that we need to be reviewing, evaluating, understanding what you're doing today and what you're trying to accomplish tomorrow.
And
right.
The one thing I'll add, and Cam hit on it a little bit, but I'll elaborate on it. And Eric, I think you could attest to this as well. We're seeing so many folks and so many organizations that are interested in change management, change leadership initiatives, because traditionally IT projects, platform implementations, any digital transformation has been driven and almost exclusively performed by the IT department. And our client has really seen some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges that have come out of that in the past. And this is really a chance for them to get the organization involved. And we're going to hit on this later down in our discussion, I'm sure, but it's really trying to get people to say, this is something we need your input and we need you to be involved. And you can't just say lift and shift and we'll train you how to use this platform. You need to be involved in setting this up, and you need to be involved in the change from the beginning.
Yeah, great point. So to address some of these challenges that you guys have mentioned as far as the impact or the change to the organization, what if we just sort of back up or start at the highest level here and work our way down into the details, what's the general change strategy in particular for this digital transformation? What sort of approach are we taking, or how did we get started? That might be a good place to start. What are your thoughts on that, Mitch?
Yeah, so really we got started, and our whole goal when we first engaged with the client was to just understand where they're at. And our change management strategy has really been to meet the client where they're at and to help to identify any pitfalls that we're seeing on where they're going, and to make the deliverables that we're putting in front of them relevant. We talked with some of their experience. I mean, they're a large company. They've worked with Big Four and basically any consultancy out there. And what's been different about us and our strategy has been we're not shoving a methodology down their throat. We are really trying to understand them, navigate their people. We're trying to navigate their structures, and we're trying to meet them where they are and to just help them along the way.
Yeah, great point. I think a lot of organizations and project teams forget that, or just intentionally ignore where they're at. They sort of focus on, let's get to the future state. We know we're going to change our culture. We know we're going to change our way of doing business, which is partially true, but you have to understand where you're starting from in order to get there. So that's a really good observation or point. How about Cam or Nate, anything to add in terms of the general, sort of the general change strategy in addition to meeting the client where they are today and helping them start to migrate to where they're headed?
Nate, want to go first?
Yeah, and I'll just say that I think, I think to elaborate with what Mitch said is change management. You have a structure to every project, and I always go back to the difference with when you go to a platform implementation. It's a very set standard. You do this, you do this, you do this. It's very linear. The steps are really well known. Change management's a little bit different. So you come in with a structure, where you are, what steps you need to take, and the programs that you need to implement. But it's a constantly changing, and it's constantly shifting to the needs of the client and to the strengths and to the comfort level of the client. So while we come into a project like the one we're on now, we know, like I would say, I'd use the analogy of building a house. We know the steps you need to take to build a house, but you're going to be working with the client throughout the project to adjust the intricacies of what you're doing to meet what their needs are. So it's not just a one size fits all solution.
Yeah, and maybe one of you could talk just real quickly about how we go about ascertaining some of these strengths and weaknesses of a current situation and helping define the change strategy in the form of that organizational readiness assessment. Could one of you maybe just sort of elaborate on that step in our process a little bit? How do we get that foundation or that clear strategy and plan based on that spirit of meeting the client where they are today, but also understanding where they're headed in the future? Could one of you maybe unpack that or just describe at a high level what that organizational readiness assessment is and how that fits into what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one. There's things that we do in an assessment like this is to try and bucket observations into themes. And by taking these themes and applying a broad strategy to a theme, we're able to take a pretty broad abstract topic and turn it in. When we're talking with our client, we often try to identify things such as resistance, but there's multiple types of resistance. There's intentional and unintentional, and you tackle those things differently based on whether or not someone is resisting the change because they just don't like the product at they weren't included, or maybe it's unintentional being a detractor, and we need to help to guide them along. And it's a change in approach based on, where each one of those changes falls into those buckets of themes.
Yeah. And generally we get to those themes, or we conclude those themes based on sort of a two-prong change readiness assessment, where we go in and we do online anonymous surveys, but we also do qualitative focus groups. And then during that data gathering, quantitative and qualitative data gathering, and we use that input to then analyze to understand what are the nuances of this particular organization compared to others that we work with, and what are the pitfalls that this organization is going to face, and ultimately what is the most effective change strategy and plan that we can tailor for this particular situation. So I think that, that upfront assessment piece really gets to the heart of what you guys are saying, which is so important, which is to sort of frame this, or to create a strategy and plan that is not one size fits all, but is more specific to a client's particular situation. Many of you may be certified in Prosci. Many of you may have maybe just heard of what Prosci is, and ADKAR, the framework that goes along with that. And so a question we often get is, how does Third Stage view Prosci and ADKAR? And Prosci and ADKAR are very good, very common, and very strong starting point tool sets. But like any tool set, you have to know when and how to use those tools to be effective. Just like everything we talk about in this video, so much of what we talk about is meant to provide a tool set to you so that you can have things in your hip pocket to be able to use as needed, depending on the situation you're in. And the same holds true for Prosci and ADKAR. So in this segment, we want to talk more specifically about what Prosci and ADKAR is and how it fits into everything we've talked about so far in this video. The first thing to recognize is that it's premature early on to define whether or not an ADKAR model or some other methodology is or isn't appropriate for your change initiative if we haven't done a change assessment yet. Every client we work with looks different. They have a different culture. They have different goals and objectives. The transformation they're about to go through looks much different. And they have different pitfalls and organizational landmines that they have to deal with and that we have to deal with in helping them through that. And so we need to assess the landscape, understand what are those pitfalls, what's the potential resistance for change, what are the sources of the resistance for change, how are we going to overcome that change. All that stuff needs to be defined first, and we can't define any of that stuff until we've done that organizational assessment. So typically what we do is we'll do a two-prong approach. We'll do a quantitative organizational survey combined with qualitative focus groups to get a better understanding of what is the culture, what are those likely sources of resistance going to be, and what are the likely enablers of change, and ultimately give us the answers, or give us the inputs to define the answers for what is the best organizational change strategy given our culture and our unique landscape and our unique transformation strategy. We've got to define what's best for us, and the only way to do that and to define which tool set we have is to first conduct that organizational assessment. So once we've assessed the organization, we understand where we are today, where the pitfalls are, what our change strategy at a high level might be. We then need to figure out how are we going to get internal alignment? How are we going to make sure that our executives are aligned on what this change is, what the transformation goals and objectives are, and importantly, what are those business drivers and the measurable results we're trying to get at? And that's probably the key of what's missing from many change management initiatives, is that measurable, tangible business value. Change management too often becomes a very academic, fluffy, feel-good exercise that isn't grounded or rooted in any sort of business results. And we need business results at the end of the day. Otherwise, why are we investing in these change efforts? So we need to first get the executive view of what the business results are they're trying to accomplish, and also what are the parameters for the transformation. Are we trying to create a culture that looks different than the way we are today? Are we trying to drive more of a standardized operating model? Are we trying to increase flexibility through the organization and agility? Are we trying to bend our culture in a certain direction? We need to have clarity from the executives on what it is they're trying to accomplish, compare that to the organizational assessment we've done, to then define what is that strategy and plan that's going to allow us to best enable some of those expected changes. The next thing we need to do to augment Prosci and ADKAR methodologies is to define what our future state business processes and operating model are going to be. What is it that we're going to change from a workflow perspective, from a business operations? If we're improving our supply chain, what's that going to look like? If we're standardizing and consolidating into a shared service model. What does that look like? What are the roles and responsibilities? A lot of questions that need to be answered before we can start talking about how we're going to enable the change and how we're going to affect the change. Now, I've recently written an article that's called the Trojan Horse Approach to Organizational Change Management. And this is an important concept because what we found in our consulting practice is that change efforts are most effective when we don't have a standalone separate change team or change group. Change should be embedded throughout the organization and throughout the change effort. So people that are, for example, defining business process improvements should ideally be equipped and enabled to enable those changes and fuel and adapt those changes to the organization, rather than passing the business process changes over the wall to the change management team, who will then figure out how we're going to enable people to accept that change. And this is also true for our own consulting practice. The most effective change consultants we have are the ones that aren't actually change management consultants. They are broader business consultants that happen to have a strong change methodology and tool set, but they can also do other things too. They can re-engineer business processes, they can program manage, they can manage other aspects of the technical and people and process components of the transformation. So really embedding organizational change management into the overall effort is very important, and that all starts with defining your business processes and workflows and what you want that future state operating model to be. And within that operating model future state, we also want to identify what the change impacts are. How are people changed? Not at the corporate big picture level necessarily, but at the individual work group, department, and ultimately individual employee level. How are people affected? Once we understand the difference between where people are today, where they are tomorrow, we can then figure out what the right tool set and methodology is to help get them there. Now, an often overlooked aspect of Prosci-driven organizational change programs is the whole concept of organizational design. And this involves really rolling up our sleeves and analyzing roles and responsibilities, job descriptions, and how the organization is designed in general, because usually that's going to change as part of your transformation, but not enough organizations think about that. They are usually thinking about how technology will change the business. They might be thinking about how business processes are going to change, but they very rarely are thinking about how the organization should be designed to support that change. And without having that input into our change program, we're not going to be successful, whether it's Prosci certified or not. So we need to have that as a prerequisite, is understanding how our organization is going to be designed, what are the impacts of the people, what are the risks, what sort of resistance will we see, how are we going to transition people into different jobs, and in some cases maybe even out of the company. Those are very sensitive issues that involve people and very sensitive topics. So we want to make sure that we have a clear vision for how the organization is going to be designed so that we can create a tailored change strategy, plan, methodology, and tool set to enable those changes. So I discussed earlier about how we often take a Trojan horse approach to change management. And that's an important part of closing statement here and how to make your change efforts more successful. We want to make sure ultimately that our change efforts are fully embedded with and integrated with our overall program and our overall transformation. Now, that may sound like a no-brainer. You may think that every company naturally does that, or every project team naturally does that. But again, it's back to the point of we want to make sure our change management team isn't over in a silo doing their own thing, following their own methodologies and processes, without fully understanding and being part of what is that overall transformation. So, for example, we used the example earlier in the video about business process changes and how ultimately or ideally you'd want to have the change team involved in those process definition exercises. And ideally, it'd be the same people that are defining process changes and improvements as would be enabling the change. So that's just one example of how we can integrate our workflows and integrate change management into our overall program. It's not just a matter of making sure that change management meets the same milestones and deadlines of the overall program, but it's also a matter of how we manage the project and manage those work streams and integrate them and bring them together into more of a cohesive approach. So I in no way want to suggest that Prosci and ADKAR certification is not relevant or not important, because a lot of people find value in it. People that we've worked with on the client side and our own consultants that have been through the program speak very highly of it in general. It's very popular. In fact, it's one of the few, if not the most popular, organizational change certification program out there. So they're doing a very good service for the organizational change management profession. But the downside is we want to make sure we don't view that like a silver bullet. It's not a silver bullet. It's not the one thing that's going to make you successful. And if you've never done change before and you've just got Prosci certified, the certification does not make you anywhere close to being ready to manage a transformation. A good analogy to this would be if you're about to go get heart surgery. Do you want the guy that just went through a quick certification program to do the heart surgery on you, or do you want the guy or gal that's been a surgeon for a long time, been through a lot of different types of scenarios, and been battle tested? That's the type of change expectation we should have for ourselves and for our change initiatives, is we should have people there that have been through this many, many times. Maybe they have the certifications, maybe they don't, but at the very least, we know that they've been through these types of transformations, they have the battle wounds, they can drive business results, they can get their hands dirty in the process improvements, they can integrate with the rest of the program. That's the type of stuff we need to round out the picture to be more effective with change. Now, I want to go a little deeper and a little bit narrower here in this next section and talk more specifically about change management and how it typically looks in complex ERP implementations, most notably SAP implementations. Now, before you stop and say, well, maybe we're not even implementing SAP or that's not part of what our transformation entails, the reason I'm calling out SAP here is because SAP implementations have a tendency to have more of a complex change management situation that organizations are dealing with. Not because SAP is necessarily a more complex product, although it is a complex product, but more so because the organizations implementing SAP are typically very large, complex, multinational, diverse organizations, and those are some of the messiest, most complex people change initiatives you could possibly go through. So what I want to do now is dive a little bit deeper into some case studies of how we apply change management in some of these complex transformations like SAP and other types of ERP implementations. When we think about change management for S/4HANA deployments, it's important to think about it not just in the context of user adoption, in other words, how do we use the system, but to really think more strategically around how can S/4HANA and how will S/4HANA more strategically change our organization, and how can we leverage change management to enable some of those more strategic changes. The other thing to recognize is that even if you're an SAP shop that's already using ECC or R3 or one of the legacy SAP products and you're moving to S/4HANA, S/4HANA is a big deal. It's a big change from those old SAP systems. So this is going to be a lot more disruptive and a lot more of a change than you might think. And so change management is especially critical in that sort of transformation. And this is exactly what I want to talk about here today. One of the biggest headwinds that S/4HANA transformations face is that these larger organizations oftentimes have trouble getting their executives aligned on what exactly this project is and how exactly they want to change their organization to work within the context of an S/4HANA rollout. So for example, S/4HANA provides an opportunity to consolidate operations, to create a common operating model, to tie together disparate operations throughout the globe. If you've gone through mergers and acquisitions, it's an opportunity to act like one company instead of multiple companies. So with that comes the need to make sure that executives and other key stakeholders within your organization are all aligned on what exactly this transformation means to your organization. Now, it's a lot more than just saying we're going to implement new technology, we're going to replace our old SAP system or our old legacy system. There's a lot more to it than that. There's decisions and alignment that need to be achieved around what do we want to be when we grow up? How much do we want to standardize our business operations? How independent do we want to allow different parts of the organization to remain or not? Those types of decisions need to be made quickly and early in the project before you start building, testing, and rolling out new S/4HANA technology. And when executives and stakeholders are not aligned on some of those answers, that's what creates the headwinds that oftentimes leads to challenges and ultimately failure for a lot of S/4HANA transformations. So one of the first steps in an effective change management strategy and plan is to make sure that you facilitate a process to ensure that your executives are aligned, you're all headed in the same direction, marching to the same beat of a drum, and all have a clear vision of what it is you want to be when you grow up. A second very important component of organizational change management as it relates to S/4HANA transformations is the whole concept of organizational design. What do we want this organization to look like as we move forward? I mentioned before that S/4HANA transformations provide the opportunity to move to a shared services model, for example, where you might consolidate your accounting or your IT or HR or procurement functions into a centralized common business operating model. That's one opportunity. You have other opportunities to move to a common operating model or a common set of operating business processes throughout the globe or throughout multiple locations. And that sort of change will typically require organizational design and definition of what people's roles and responsibilities are going to be, especially in the case of moving to a shared services model or a common business process model. Those require pretty significant changes to people's jobs and significant changes to the human component of an S/4HANA transformation. There's also the gap analysis component here that we've got to consider as part of our organizational design activities. We have the gap analysis between where we are today and how people are operating today and what their jobs look like today and what they're going to look like in the future. You also have the gap analysis between the system and its capabilities and what your needs are as an organization. And sometimes there's a gap there. S/4HANA isn't a perfect solution, nor is any other solution out there in the marketplace. So we need to figure out what are those gaps and how are we going to shore up some of those gaps from a change management perspective. And then another thing to think about as it relates to organizational design is a conversation that most of us probably don't want to have, and that is, what about jobs that might get automated or lost in this whole process? With S/4HANA comes pretty significant automation opportunities with robotic process automation and machine learning, artificial intelligence, and it's just accelerating. SAP is investing heavily in those areas. So over time, the capabilities for S/4HANA to automate your business is going to increase, which is a good thing from a profit and loss and efficiency perspective. But what does that mean to people's jobs? How will they be impacted? Will people be displaced? If they are going to be displaced, do we need to retrain them? Do we need to move them somewhere else? That is a really important part of organizational design, and also benefits realization and realizing the business value of your S/4HANA investment is going to come from. So these are all things we need to think about as it relates to organizational design, which is an important part of your organizational change strategy as part of your S/4HANA transformation. Anytime you introduce new technology into an organization, you're introducing some sort of cultural change, whether you intend to or not. You're not going to change who you are overnight. Your culture has been developed over years and decades, potentially over 100 years, depending on how old your organization is. So introducing a new technology isn't going to change things overnight, but you want to be deliberate about how you might bend your culture to fit where it is you're headed in the future. So for example, I used the example earlier about the organization that goes out and acquires companies through mergers and acquisitions. If you're an organization that has grown through merger and acquisition, or even if you've achieved organic growth, chances are you've probably organically grown and your culture has organically evolved over time. And now you may be looking at this as an opportunity to act more like one company, to act like a unified company, to have common business processes. And that requires a cultural mindset change to employees in the way they do their jobs. So you want to have a clear cultural change plan and a cultural change strategy that puts you in the driver's seat of how do we want our culture to look and how are we going to use this S/4HANA transformation to shape our culture and to bend our culture to become who we want to become in the future. And if we don't spend time focusing on that, the culture is going to evolve or maybe even devolve into something that we don't necessarily want. So having a clear vision for that culture and the cultural change that we're aspiring for is something that's critical to consider and include as part of your change strategy. Training is probably the most commonly understood aspect of change management. When we think about organizational change, we think we need to train people how to use S/4HANA or how to use our new system, how to conduct their new processes. That certainly is true, but training needs to entail more than just how to conduct transactions within a system. We have to train people in a way that's customized to our organization, how their business processes are going to flow, what their job looks like in the context of this new S/4HANA transformation, and even what our business processes and decision-making processes are outside of the system. So we've got to define all that stuff and train people in all that stuff as part of the end-user training. So we have to go well beyond just teaching someone how to create a purchase order or teaching someone how to close the books in the S/4HANA technology. We need to talk about how you specifically are going to conduct your job both inside and outside the S/4HANA system. And we also need to educate you on how that is different than the way you're doing things today and why you're doing things differently. So this all requires a great deal of customization to ensure that we have a training approach that's tailored to your organization. The other thing to consider is that most training materials that come with an S/4HANA deployment are going to be very generic. They're going to be not tailored to your industry or your business processes or the way you've configured or customized the S/4HANA technology. So you want to make sure that you're tailoring those materials for your organization. Now, SAP has a product called SAP Enable Now. I believe it's a product that they acquired, and it's a way to tailor some of the training materials for your specific organization. So they do have a tool set available to help you do that. There's also third-party systems out there, and some of them are better and more cost-effective than Enable Now. And they're also technology agnostic and independent, which I'm happy to share with you information about those technologies. But the point here is you have options out there. There's tools that will allow you to tailor your training materials for your organization, for your industry, for your business processes, and for individual people and work groups within the organization. So be sure you're investing the right amount of time and money in your project plan and overall budget to tailor your training materials for your organization. This is an area that most change programs that we see that we're not involved with, they tend to overlook that area. So we want to make sure we invest heavily in the customization of training materials for your S/4HANA transformation. Now, even if you're an existing SAP customer moving to S/4HANA, chances are an S/4HANA deployment is going to have a massive impact on the types of IT skills and capabilities you need to have in-house. It's not a matter of whether or not your people are capable of learning it, but it's a matter of making sure they've got the right skills, make sure you bring in the right people that have the right skills to support this future state. For example, many S/4HANA deployments are cloud-based, and that's a lot different than the old on-premise R3 or ECC implementations. So the point here is when you look at all the impacts that this is going to have to your organization and the types of skills that are required, the types of upskill and potentially going out and bringing in new people, we have to think about what is our IT organization going to look like in the future? Are we going to have the same size IT organization? Are we going to grow our IT organization? Are we going to scale it back? Are we going to swap people in and out? Are we going to retrain them? We need to have a very solid plan for how IT is going to not only support the implementation, but also how they're going to support S/4HANA in the longer term post-implementation. So one of the most important points or components of a change strategy for S/4HANA transformations is making sure we've looked at our IT organization and redefined as appropriate what that IT organization is going to look like and put together a plan to help us transition to that future state of our IT organization. Now, one thing I'll note is the longer you wait to do this and the more behind you get on this particular aspect of change management, the more likely it is your system integrator is going to come in and run the program for you, and it's going to be harder for them to leave. It's going to be harder for you to wean yourself off that system integrator when you haven't built an IT organization that's able to keep up and able to have the right level of skill set and competency to support the implementation. So my recommendation here would be not to wait until you're getting close to go live to then think about how is IT going to support this longer term, but instead think about that up front. What does the organization need to look like, and how can we build out a more robust, more appropriate, right-sized IT organization to support our S/4HANA environment early in the process so we're not overly dependent on system integrators or outside consultants, and we can actually be more of an equal partner with that outside system integrator. I mean, you both have experience with change management on S/4HANA implementations, but as you guys have mentioned here in your introductions, also other ERP implementations as well. And I think one of the themes we're probably going to get to here today is that a lot of what we talk about today, even though the topic is S/4HANA implementations, it's really relevant to any sort of ERP implementation as well. And maybe as a starting point, let's start with you, Sarah. You know, as a general starting point, why is change management so important in S/4HANA implementations or any ERP implementation for that matter?
Yes, I mean, I kind of reiterating what you're saying, Eric, that change management is absolutely crucial kind of for any ERP or digital transformation. And I think really this is because essentially these projects, whilst they're technical in nature, they're all about people. So it's all about the end users and how the end users are using that system. So at the end of the day, it's kind of the end user that has to go on that transformation journey. And they're the people who are going to be using the new system, you know, once the project's closed down and the project team has disbanded and, you know, moved on to other things. So in order to kind of ensure that people use that new system fully and gain all the wonderful benefits that you get, you know, listed in the business benefits case, change management, it must be effectively embedded and the changes to make them manageable to the end users. So again, it really goes back to it's all about the people. And whilst you might have this, you know, shiny new ERP tool to play with, if nobody understands kind of how to use it or why you're using it in the first place, it's just not going to work. And so that's kind of the crux of it, I would say.
Yeah, makes total sense. It seems like, you know, S/4HANA projects are so complex and the software is so complex that, you know, a lot of times you get so caught up in just making the technology work that you forget about that important people side, it seems. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Julia? Why is change management so important?
I think really just to echo Sarah's points is that change management is only as good as the individuals that are using it, or an ERP is only as good as the individuals that are using it. If you have a shiny multi-million-pound new spanking new system that no one knows how to use or are unhappy with it or can't get to grips with it or still want to use the legacy systems or spreadsheets, you really aren't going to get that return on that investment.
Right. Yeah, that's a key point. That last thing you just said about return on investment and, getting actual business value out of the system and deploying a system that not only works technically, but works from a people and operational perspective as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
I'd be curious to hear from the audience too. Why do you all think change is so important? Is it important? I mean, I'd be curious to hear if anyone thinks change management isn't important. I'd be surprised if we heard that, but you never know. I'd love to hear from the audience your views on change management and why it's so important. How do you see change management being different for S/4HANA implementations compared to other sorts of technology or business change initiatives that you've been involved with?
I think initially what I would say is that every change implementation is different because there's a number of different variables in there, including what people have used before, what the organizational what's the word I'm looking for, appetite is for change, what the kind of, what the culture is in the organization. So there's lots of different variables that will impact change and that change journey. And the ERP, or what the solution is one of those variables. So notwithstanding those, using SAP for HANA, I think it's a big system. Okay, it's a big system with lots of bits. I think it's quite complex for people to get their heads around, especially if you've come from lots of legacy systems. Again, one of the questions is where's that gap of where you've come from to where you're going to? If you've come from, I don't know, a bunch of spreadsheets and legacy systems, that jump to SAP for HANA is potentially massive for people. That's it's a big jump for people to actually make in terms of their heads and their abilities and capabilities. And even if you've come from a previous iteration of SAP, it's still quite a big jump in terms of the way that it's used differently. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that every change is different, and there's lots of variables involved in delivery of that change.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes total sense. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really. I think the key for me is that kind of it doesn't really matter almost what system you're using. You're still going to have to go through that same change management framework process. So you're still going to need to do, change management strategy and plan, your readiness assessments, all the comms and the training, all this really good stuff that's really important for people to make that journey. But I think it's really important to make sure that your impact assessment, so, Julia kind of mentioned it, but looking at how the organization is today and how it's going to look in the future, doing that assessment in enough depth and enough coverage is really important, because if you don't know how it's changing, you can't kind of guide people through that journey. And I think it's the same for, SAP or S/4HANA, but any kind of ERP system. You're going to have to do that assessment to make sure it's effective, and ultimately make sure that people know what's going on, when we switch it on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes total sense. And then I also want to turn to the audience too. I had asked a couple questions of them. I asked where they're joining from first and foremost. We have people from all over the world, as I mentioned before. We have Natalia from London, UK, Sandra from Regina, SK. It's Aditya from Calgary, Canada. Someone joining from Divya, USA, Boston, Massachusetts, New Brunswick, Canada, Curacao, Williamstead, Curacao, very pretty part of the world. So thank you all for joining here today, people from all over the world. So thank you for that. A couple of comments too. This is from Tofik on LinkedIn. Tofik, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly or close to correctly. He says change management is the key to success. So at least we have one person on board so far, at least one person that's agreeing that change management is really important. So thank you for that. And then also from LinkedIn, this is from Alcinda. Alcinda says change management is one of the key levers you pull to execute a digital strategy. Otherwise, you would have just spent that investment on a shiny object that isn't used. I think that's very consistent with what you both just alluded to as well. S/4HANA is a great technology, a lot of groundbreaking stuff and capability in the software, but that doesn't really matter if people aren't using it and it's not helping make the business and the operations better. So thank you for that feedback. In these first 11 sections of this training, I've talked a lot about conceptual ideas around what change management is, how to develop a strategy and plan, how to overcome resistance and user adoption issues, that sort of thing. All important stuff, and I hope it's been helpful to you so far. What I want to do in this last section of the training is to talk about the future of change management. Where are we headed in the world of change management and people-driven change? That's what we're going to dive into here in today's last segment.
Humble beginnings, right? In a small warehouse in northern Colorado is kind of where I started. We now have a physical footprint in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Spain and Portugal. But there is an affiliate network around the entire globe where you can access Prosci training programs. So within Africa, we have several partners. And if you Google Prosci Global Partner Network, you'll track down information about CEDAR and Change, our friends that are down that way.
Great. So I guess just to jump into here about the problem statement that you guys are trying to solve with Prosci, and that is that change is hard in general. Or if this was easy, you and I probably wouldn't be in business, quite frankly. You and I would probably you'd be in economics, and I don't know what I'd be doing, but it wouldn't be this probably. So change is hard. Organizations struggle with it. Why is that? You've seen so many organizations, you've certified so many people that are thirsting for learning about change, but why is it such a difficult discipline?
Well, I think it gets back to that notion, and I've been talking about the two sides of the change coin, right? That there's a technical side of every change where we design, develop, and deliver a solution that meets the need, the issue, the opportunity in front of us. You do a lot of work with your clients doing ERPs, right? That's one flavor of technical solution. CRMs would be electronic health records in a hospital, merger, acquisition. Even a new value system is a technical side of a change, right? The people side of the change is how do we get people to embrace, adopt, and use whatever that solution is. And although in this change discipline, if you've been a practitioner and you hear it called the soft side of change, it just makes your skin crawl, right? Because I think the reason it's hard, Eric, is that this is the harder side of change. The technical side of change can be incredibly complex. Merging two big organizations, absolutely. There's technical complexity in terms of pulling this financial systems together, branding, blah, blah, blah. The real hard side of the change is getting people to step into this new way of working. It's helping individuals navigate, step out of where they are today, step through whatever that transition, the liminal movement is going to be, and step into that new way of being. And so I think the reason it's hard is because the people side of change is the harder side of change. Now, historically, in a value system where your employees were incented for just, asking how high when you told them to jump, predictability, consistency, that was the value system historically. Change was easier then because the values aligned with asking somebody to do something different. But new value systems over the last 20 years, the emergence of, the interaction economy out of the service and knowledge economy, these things have all amplified the people side of change as something that we cannot just leave up to giving the right commands, but it's really around helping people navigate that journey. And I know we're going to end up talking about the pandemic too, but the pandemic just amplified. It made the people side of change impossible to ignore. If you were one of those organizations or projects that did ignore it and leave the people side of change to chance, historically.
So when most people think about organizational change management, and this includes ERP consultants, software vendors, system integrators, most of them think about training and communications, things that are focused on a transactional aspect of the software. How do I type whatever I need to type into the system? How do I find the field I need? How do I do something in the system to make sure that the process works? And the problem with that approach is two things. One is it's focused on a very transactional aspect of change, which is important, but the more important thing is the more strategic aspect of change, and we'll get to that here in a second. The second problem is that by the time we get to training and communications, it's too late. That stuff is mostly downstream after we have something to communicate and something to train people on. By then, people have already formed their resistance to change or their confusion or whatever the problems are earlier in the transformation cycle. So by the time we start communicating aspects of the changes and doing the training, that's not enough, and it's too late at that point. So we really have to look at what can we do differently to affect the change earlier in the process and ensure that we are proactively addressing some of the resistance that happens from change. We were working with one of our larger clients recently, and this is a very large, very successful client, very well-known company that is very disruptive and innovative in their industry. And their industry is an industry that's not known for innovation or disruption. And back in the 80s, they completely turned the industry on its head with an entirely new business model, commodity-based types of products. And we're working with them through a large digital transformation right now. They're a few years into a massive multi-year implementation. And one of the things we're helping them with is organizational change management. And the client here in this case shared with us how they don't like the term change management. They don't like the concept of change management. They, on one hand, understand the need to manage the human aspects of change, and they know that they need to change, but they don't like the concept of formalized organizational change management as a program. So one of the things I learned from this client, and it's a common pattern we see with a lot of different clients, is that people in general resist organizational change management when it's a standalone team or a standalone activity that's focused on change. So one of the things we recommend to our clients is to find a way to bake organizational change into more of the core DNA of what the project team does. So for example, instead of having an entire team where all they're doing is organizational change management, it can be very effective to instead diffuse that organizational change responsibility to other parts of the team, and more importantly, business users and stakeholders that maybe aren't part of the project team, but they're the people that are going to own these changes and these new business processes and new job designs and roles and responsibilities going forward. So if we can get them to own the organizational change and do that not under the guise of organizational change management as a separate program, but just part of what they do and the DNA of what they do, that can be a lot more effective than what we've seen in traditional organizational change management approaches. The question becomes, how do we make it part of our DNA, and what exactly does that mean? And one of the things that we found to be very successful with a lot of clients is to, behind the scenes, craft the organizational change strategy based on the unique needs of the organization and the unique culture of the organization, and provide the change templates and methods and tools, but have the business owners, the stakeholders, mid-level management executives, different components or different people within the organization that aren't necessarily part of the transformation project team, have them own the change and deliver the change and be the face of change, and also be the voice of the front lines, so that we can also not just share changes and have them push communications and changes out to the organization, but also get a pulse on what's happening as the changes are happening on the front line. So if people are freaking out because it's too much change, or they don't understand the change, or whatever it might be, we have ways to capture that input along the way. And this can be a very effective way to ensure that we have more people owning change rather than just a small concentrated group of change professionals or change team members where their only job is to focus on change management. Now, the risk of doing this approach that I'm mentioning here is that oftentimes transformations are more complex than we expect. It oftentimes takes more time and money than we expect. And if we end up getting backed into a corner and end up having to cut something in order to meet our deadline or to meet our budget that we're trending to exceed, we're probably going to cut change management. It becomes very easy to let change management to fall by the wayside so that we can focus on doing the other more tangible stuff that we can see that's immediately in front of us, which usually has more to do about the technology. So we have to make sure that we have a good strategy that isn't something that's going to be attractive to cut from the overall strategy and scope of what it is we're doing during our transformation. One of the most common things that organizations overlook when going through their transformations and building their organizational change strategies and plans is the whole concept of culture. Too often, companies come in with a cookie cutter approach to change management, whether it be a Prosci type of approach, or software vendors sometimes have their own OCM light methodologies. System integrators will have their OCM light methodologies. And oftentimes there's a cookie cutter that don't take into account the culture of the organization and what it is that we're trying to become as an organization. So as an example, a lot of companies we work with are global multinational companies that are growing organically throughout the world. They're acquiring other companies. And over the years, they've grown a decentralized, siloed type of organization, and they've built enough critical mass and scale that now they want to figure out, how do we pull this all together and how do we act more like a grown-up company that acts like one company. And on paper, that sounds good. In theory, it sounds good as well. But getting there is a lot more difficult, especially when people are used to operating decentralized and doing whatever they want, for lack of a better word. And now we're going to come in and tell them how they have to operate because corporate says that there's a mandate for us to operate a certain way. So in order to get there, we need to be mindful of the fact that that's a big cultural shift. And people aren't just going to jump for excitement because they see the benefits or they see that the company is going to be more profitable potentially by acting more like one company. So we have to figure out, based on that cultural shift we're doing, what is the change strategy that's going to help us get there? And what are the change management tools that can best help us get there? And then the other part of culture to be aware of is that we just need to understand and make sure that our transformation in general lines up with the culture that we're trying to affect. So a lot of times organizations, in the example I just gave around wanting to standardize operations, they will not necessarily understand the level of effort it's going to take to get there and the amount of magnitude of change and how they're going to affect that change throughout the implementation. And they also oftentimes will make decisions and operate the project in a way that's inconsistent or misaligned with that desired future state culture. So we need to make sure that our overall transformation is focused on the culture we're trying to enable. And obviously that's something that goes well beyond the capabilities of any one organizational change team or organizational change work stream on a project. That's getting back to the executive level, which is something else that organizational change management should address as well. So one of the best ways to quickly get to a change strategy and plan that makes the most sense for you is to conduct an organizational readiness assessment, which would be a combination of quantitative surveys to gather a quantitative pulse on the culture of the organization and where we anticipate some of the resistance to change or the difficulties with change might come from, and also qualitative focus groups, so really understanding and unpacking the culture and the different political nuances and internal dynamics that we need to consider so that we can create a change tool set or a change plan that focuses on who you are as an organization today, the pitfalls along the way, and where it is we're headed in terms of transforming our culture. So that's probably the biggest word of advice I could leave, is to make sure to conduct that organizational readiness assessment. And that's something that having a dedicated or a focused organizational change team can add a lot of value, is by conducting that assessment and creating the plan that goes behind that. But when it comes time to execute that plan and to push the changes through the organization, that's where we need to diffuse the organizational change activities in a more decentralized way and let the business own that and make that part of the DNA and take that Trojan horse approach that I mentioned earlier. Now, I hope you found this training helpful. I hope that it gives you some thoughts on how you might structure your strategy and plan for addressing change management and user adoption issues. If you'd like to learn more about organizational change strategies and tactics that you can be using to make your project more effective, be sure to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management on our website. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or go to the links below. So I hope you found this training course helpful, and I hope you have a great day.